It being shortly after 10:30, I declare open this public hearing of the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee. This public hearing is for the committee's inquiry into human rights implications of recent violence in Iran. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. A video broadcast is streaming live via the web, which can be found at www.aph.gov.au. Information on procedural rules governing public hearings and claims of public interest immunity have been provided to witnesses. I remind all participants to identify themselves before they speak and to mute themselves until they need to speak or ask questions. I remind everyone in the gallery that they are not permitted to speak or interfere with the proceedings or with witnesses at any point during the hearing. Witnesses who are seeking to table documents during the committee's hearing, could you please liaise with the Secretariat so that they can make copies for the senators in the room. My name is Senator Claire Chandler and I'm the chair of the committee. Joining us today is Senator Ciccone, the deputy chair, as well as Senators Fawcett, and other senators may join us as the day goes on. I'd like to welcome Mr Hillel Noor from the United Nations Watch in Geneva. I understand it is quite early in the morning for you, so thank you very much for making the time to appear today. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear?
My name is Hillel Noor, and I'm the Executive Director of United Nations Watch.
Thank you, Mr Noor. Would you like to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions?
Yes, I would.
Very good. In the interest of managing time, it would be greatly appreciated, Mr Noor, if you could keep your opening statement to a couple of minutes and table any longer opening statements or remarks for the committee record.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Noor.
I would like to thank the committee for this opportunity to testify in the human rights implications of recent violence in Iran. We welcome the recent UN special session that was held in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. This is something that our organization called for over a decade. Indeed, in September 2009, we formally requested a special session of the Human Rights Council, invited human rights activist Nazanin Afshinjam and former political prisoner Ahmed Batabi, who spoke on behalf of 50 human rights activists from Iran to demand a special session, and we've been calling for it since. So we're very grateful that it was just held a few days ago in Geneva. We're grateful that a fact-finding mission was created. At the same time, we acknowledge that this should have happened at least a decade ago, and we had many other crises in Iran, including in November 2019, and it should have happened before. So it's late, but better late than never. Going forward at the United Nations, which is our focus, we're looking to December. The United States government has requested a meeting of the UN Economic and Social Council in the week of December 12th to terminate the membership of Iran from the UN's highest women's rights body, which is the Commission on the Status of Women. Now, the Islamic Republic of Iran was obscenely elected to this body in April 2021. The world was silent at this election. It was our organization that exclusively documented and exposed this election. In April 2021, we further revealed that though it was a secret ballot, there were 15 Western and EU members of ECOSOC, including Australia, and only 11 did not vote for Iran because they received 43 out of 54 votes voted for Iran. That means a minimum of 4 Western and EU states necessarily voted for the Islamic Republic onto the Women's Rights Commission. And we demand that countries reveal how they vote. Governments typically say we can't reveal a secret ballot, but the Canadian ambassador, Bob Rae, a few days after the election revealed that Canada did not vote for Iran. Similarly, when Saudi Arabia was likewise outrageously elected several years prior in 2017, the Belgian Prime Minister Charles Michel appeared before the Belgian Parliament and revealed that he did vote for Saudi Arabia. So at this time, we note that the Australian government was a member of ECOSOC when that body elected the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're asking that Australia reveal, in the interests of transparency, that it reveal how they voted. We trust that Australia did not vote for the Islamic Republic, but we call on them to reveal how they voted. Going forward, we ask that the Australian government take a strong stand in calling for the removal of the Islamic Republic. We note that since we made our submission, the Australian Foreign Ministry in their mission to this committee has stated that they oppose Iran's membership and that they call for their removal. However, we would like them to take a stronger stand. We note that the Dutch foreign minister recently told their parliament that he is not supporting removing the Islamic Republic. He gave 3 reasons for doing so. We don't believe any of them is valid. So we would like the Australian government not only to reveal how they voted, but to take a leadership position in calling for Iran's removal from that commission. I will just end my brief remarks by saying that we note that in its submission, the Australian government has said that it is keeping its sanctions regime under regular review. We understand that Australia to date has failed to impose multiple tranches of sanctions and other punitive measures against the Islamic Republic since the protests began in September, as other governments such as the United States, Canada, the UK, and the European Union have done. We call on the Australian government to take action, whether it's sanctioning entities and individuals involved in transferring Iranian drones to Russia to kill Ukrainian citizens in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, or whether it's listing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is a terrorist entity, to list it as a terrorist organization, as, for example, the United States has done. So we call on the Australian government to show leadership in important measures that will demonstrate to the Iranian people that the Australian government stands with them and imposes maximum pressure on the regime. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noor, and thank you for all of the work that you've undertaken in achieving the special session of the Human Rights Council, and particularly for your work on having Iran removed from the Commission on the Status of Women. I've been calling for Australia to take a lead role on the removal of Iran from the Commission since the 20th of September this year. Do you have any insight as to why it may have taken a period of time for there have been to be a solid view expressed by the government on this front?
Well, I can certainly tell you that, unfortunately, at the United Nations, too many governments have a policy of going along to get along. I mean, the Dutch foreign minister has written a letter to his parliament after their Senate called for the removal of the Islamic Republic, giving 3 reasons why they shouldn't. His reasons were, number one, it's not nice to remove countries because the CSW is a place where everyone should be there, and that's where we reach agreement. I'm not aware of a single agreement that has been reached that has encouraged the Islamic Republic of Iran or other egregious violators to improve the status of women's rights. I believe it's only been a propaganda vehicle for them. So I think that has no basis. Secondly, he said that he asked what good it would do. I can tell you, as someone who received recently 245,000 comments from Iranians on an Instagram post that I did on the topic, the Iranian people are looking to the United Nations. They're looking to your committee. They're looking to the free world, and Australia is a very important player in the free world to send the right signals and messages. So I think that I think it would do a lot of good. And finally, the Dutch foreign minister said that if we take action on this country, what about the others that have poor records? And well, that's a fair comment to make, but let's do one at a time. It's very rare, indeed. It's never happened before in history that a country has been removed from the UN CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. There is no procedure. So I recognize that for those dealing with United Nations mechanisms, it's a headache. It's never been done before. That's why we drafted a resolution. It appears as an annex in the submission that I made to this committee. Drafted a resolution saying, with various provisions, but it says we hereby terminate the membership of the Iranian Islamic Republic from the Commission. So it can be done. It's never been done before. So if you ask me why the Australian government waited several months before answering, I recognize that it may be a headache for them. But I can tell you that for the Iranian people, the women and girls who are putting their lives on the line every single day, these symbolic actions are the minimum the United Nations can do, and it gives them tremendous moral support. So I hope Australia, although it has waited months to make this statement, I hope at this stage they take leadership in this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. And just for those in the committee room, I note that we do have a couple of people with cameras in here, and the committee is happy for you to take photos. Thank you. Mr. Neuer, what did you make of China's attempts to block action at the special session?
Well, look, I was in the room when that happened. We were all alarmed by this procedural move to prevent the creation of a fact-finding mission. What they proposed in the very last minute was to eliminate the provision that called for the fact-finding mission. And there was no consultation on that. So I think that a number of ambassadors were offended by the procedural maneuvering of China. Typically, one consults on such things. So, look, they failed. They failed. They received 6 votes saying yes for their amendment, and 25 voted against them. And that was the final vote, 25-6, which is the strongest majority that I've ever seen in 18 years at the United Nations in holding the Iranian regime to account. So that is a very strong majority. And it shows that had our democracies back in 2009, back in 2019, taken action, they may well have gotten a majority against crimes that Iran has been doing for decades. You know, the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, was on a death commission that killed thousands of people. So the crimes are not new. It's the action of the Western countries, which perhaps for too long wanted to appease Iran for the nuclear deal. There are organizations in the United States, such as NIAC, which were designed to appease the Iranian regime, which were lobbying for the regime. Unfortunately, some organizations, some human rights organizations, were appearing with NIAC, were tweeting. Ken Roth, who used to head Human Rights Watch, did a tweet praising the foreign minister, Javad Zarif, portraying him as a humanitarian, saying he has dealings with him and he'll keep his word. And there were many organizations that were trying to portray the Iranian regime as somewhat legitimate and allowing their chief propagandist, Foreign Minister Zarif, to be the smiling representative as the regime was killing people on the street. So I think, you know, President Obama acknowledged the mistake that he made recently. He acknowledged that in 2009, when the people of Iran called for the United States and other countries to support them, the United States chose not to do so. Obama recognized that was a mistake. I think some organizations that were working with NIAC recognize that's a mistake. You know, there's a blogger, a rapper rather, who was just been arrested. And he and many others are outraged that groups such as NIAC, based in Washington, were seeking to lobby for the regime. So I think other organizations that were working with them should acknowledge this was a mistake.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. We are very tight on time this morning, so I'm going to hand the call to the Deputy Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, Mr. Neuer. Thanks for appearing today. Look, I've just got a few questions that I'd like to put to you around Iran's appointment to the Commission for the Status of Women, and just for the benefit of the not just the committee but also the witnesses we have here and others that might be watching today. It's fair to say it seems astonishing that Iran was appointed to the Commission in the first place. Could you explain when and how this happened?
Yes, thank you. This happened in April 2021. There is a 54-nation organ of the United Nations called the Economic and Social Council. It elects members to the various functional commissions of the United Nations, including the Commission on the Status of Women. Iran put forward its name. There was no competition in the Asian group. And the choice for the members of the 54-nation ECOSOC was effectively to write the name of Iran on the line or to leave it blank. Only 11 nations did not vote for Iran. 43 out of 54 voted for Iran. As mentioned, this includes at least 4 Western countries and EU democracies. We do not know who they are. We hope Australia was not one of them. We ask all the countries who were members of ECOSOC at that time to reveal how they voted.
Okay, so just for the benefit of those listening, what's the process, the usual process for such appointments?
Well, the election is made by these 54 countries, and the various governments submit their candidacies. There's typically an arrangement made behind the scenes by the regional groups, and then they're submitted before the full 54-nation body, and then they voted on it.
Okay, so again, who were the members of the responsible UN committee when that decision was made to appoint Iran?
I'm going to have to come back to you on that. Give me just a second.
I guess particularly, is it the case that Australia was also on that committee?
Yeah, Australia was a member of the ECOSOC at the time, as was, to answer your question, Australia was a member, Austria, Finland, France, Latvia, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, the UK and the US. Canada was too, but Canada revealed they did not vote for Iran. The others, we don't know.
Okay. Did any groups or NGOs raise concerns about Iran's appointment at the time of when the decision was made?
When the decision was made, initially there was silence. No one wanted to talk about it. It's one of the shameful things that happened regularly at the United Nations that for various reasons people don't like to talk about. Those who are perhaps close to the UN don't want to talk about these things. UN Watch was the only organization that revealed the vote, that opposed it, and that sparked a firestorm in many countries around the world. After the election, some individuals spoke out. I'm not aware that any organization, any human rights organization spoke out in the aftermath. But of course, you'll be hearing from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, and you can ask if they spoke out at the time. I'm not aware that they did.
Okay. And from your end, though, did the government, the Australian government, take time or any steps to respond to the concerns?
I'm not aware that Australia spoke out at the time. Certainly the United States government at the time refused to directly condemn the election of Iran. They were asked by the Associated Press in a daily press briefing, and the State Department spokesman, Ned Price, very notably, and the video is available on our website and on my Twitter account, and notably evaded answering whether the United States would condemn it. And I think the other democracies kind of followed that lead. And so there was no direct condemnation at the time. In contrast, a few weeks ago, in the past few weeks, the United States is now taking the lead in condemning Iran's presence on the committee and calling for its removal. So we've seen a very stark change in the U.S. position. I'm not aware that in April 2021 or its aftermath, if there was any notable condemnation from governments of Iran's membership.
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, though, I think earlier this year, Australia, in its role as a member of that committee, did call on governments and communities to obviously take note and to do more to respond to the needs of women and girls in these situations. But Chair, I'm happy to leave my questions there in the interest of time.
Thank you very much, Senator Ciccone. Senator Steele-John.
Thanks very much, Chair. And thank you for your evidence so far, and I want to acknowledge it and also acknowledge the significant presence of the community in the room with us today. I want to begin by asking a question in relation to the removal of Iran from the UN Committee on the Status of Women. The proposal that you outlined to the committee, just as I was rolling into the room, I believe was for the kind of total removal of Iran from the committee. Do you envisage that there? I'm just in thinking through that position. Did you consider whether there would be benefits whether there would be benefit in placing additional conditions upon which Iran may be re-added to the committee to kind of make the point that they should only be considered for re-entry into such a process when XYZ condition had been met?
I think we're past that point today, Senator. Iran is beating women on the streets. They're shooting women. They are raping women. They are torturing women. We think the message today has to be clear and simple coming out of the United Nations, which is we never should have elected the Islamic Republic of Iran in April 2021. This was a misogynistic regime back then, which has a compulsory hijab law. Women's testimony in court does not count the same as men. They need men's permission to leave the country, and many other measures that systematically subjugate women. We are past the point where we can send any mixed signals. So I don't think that any carrots are going to be effective at this time. I'm not sure that they were effective in the past decades. Those who know the regime know that it hates women, and that's part of the regime's raison d'etre. It's built into the system And so I think the message has to be very clear from the United Nations. We had the emergency session. It was at least 13 years after we called for it. It's late, but it happened. We have a fact-finding mission. We commend that. The next step has to be in the week of December 12th, as requested by the United States, termination of the membership of the Islamic Republic of Iran, period. And I don't think we should take the risk of diluting that message. Obviously, they can submit their candidacy in the future, and I hope that would be a free and democratic Iran that respects women's rights, and then they should be absolutely welcome.
Thank you. Second question for you. There's been many calls from the community here in Australia to have the Revolutionary Guard Corps listed as a terrorist organisation under Australian law. That's a position that that my party supports, and we've adopted that. Do you have a position on whether that would be an additional appropriate step for Australia to take?
Yes, Senator, absolutely. We believe that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is responsible for mass murder, war, and terrorism throughout the Middle East and indeed beyond, bombing Jewish Community Center and killing dozens in Argentina back in the 90s. So this is a murderous terrorist organization. The people of Iran know this. And although we were told by some media that when Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, was killed a couple of years ago, that he was a hero for the people of Iran, we see that this was propaganda. We see that people across Iran are racing to tear down his poster all across the country. So it's a terrorist entity, and the Australian government should definitely list it as such. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm just been called into the Senate for a vote, so I'll have to leave you there. Thank you for your evidence once again, and thank you for the time you took in pulling it together for the committee today.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Steele-John. Senator Fawcett, you have the call.
And Jordan, just noticing it is a quorum, not a division. So, thank you, Mr. Newer, for your evidence and your submission. I'm interested to understand your view on the efficacy of other nations' application of Magnitsky-style sanctions, and is there any one nation in particular that you believe has identified the key people who should be subject to sanctions were Australia to go down that path?
Thank you, Senator, for asking about the Magnitsky sanctions. I'd like to say that I think they are essential. I'm actually speaking to you today from Berlin, Germany, where I'm going to see the wife of Russian political prisoner Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's in prison in Moscow because he promoted the Magnitsky sanctions against the dictatorship in Russia. And I believe that they are enormously effective. So we strongly support the Magnitsky sanctions. They're designed to target the criminals, not to hurt the people in any way, but they're designed to be tailored to target the people. I do not have with me a specific country in mind whom Australia could model itself after, but I'd be happy to follow up with the committee on that.
Yeah, if you could, that would be useful. I'd be particularly also interested in your view as to, I know a few people have said, for example, don't sanction the traditional military, just sanction the Revolutionary Guard, but I'm aware that there are a range of authorities who exercise power, whether it be members of the judiciary, whether it be the morality police, a range of people who are active in actually enforcing the oppression. Would you support applying sanctions more broadly than just the Revolutionary Guard?
Thank you, Senator. I do believe that as many of the perpetrators of gross and systematic human rights abuses, and indeed what we're seeing today probably rise to the level of crimes against humanity, should be targeted, should be sanctioned. Naming them sends a powerful signal. We saw that the Iranian people, when they rise up, one of the things they've been doing is identifying the Basiji, who work with the IRGC in killing and torturing innocent people, and they've been trying to identify them. So by giving notice to the individual perpetrators who are committing torture, beatings, murder, that their names are known, this is a very powerful measure. So yes, Senator, we would support making a broad application of the sanctions to various institutions of the Iranian regime that are currently attacking its own people.
So the final question in regards to Magnitsky sanctions, when we apply national sanctions, it obviously has an impact on every commercial business, every institution, and affects the whole community. So we are reluctant, unless necessary, to apply sanctions to a whole country. But are there commercial entities or entities of the state that are instrumental in the supply of weapons, for example, or other enablers for the Revolutionary Guard to go about their business that could be identified and sanctioned as an entity?
Thank you, Senator. I believe that there may be numerous institutions, commercial entities that are effectively arms of the Iranian regime and which fund and enable their suppression of their own people, and that they should be targeted and can be targeted in a way that would hurt the regime and not the people. I would be happy to follow up with the committee with some questions of those commercial entities.
Thank you. And my final question, which I'm happy for you to take on notice, given that we are somewhat behind schedule. You are United Nations Watch as your group. The whole process by which nations can become members of, for example, the United Nations Human Rights Council allows regional blocs to nominate countries for the seats which are allocated to that bloc. And so we saw just recently, in the most recent election for the United Nations Human Rights Council, that Asia put forward China, Pakistan, Uzbekistan and Nepal. And so when Saudi Arabia wanted to continue after 2 terms, they lost the vote there. But you could argue there are a number of those nations who do not have a human rights record that we would support. Are you aware of any moves to create a threshold for human rights abuses that would disqualify a nation from putting themselves forward or being nominated by their regional bloc? And if there is no motion or work toward that end, is that something that you think would be workable given your knowledge of the United Nations?
Yes, so thank you, Senator, for calling attention to a very important issue. Indeed, the Human Rights Council suffers from the fact that its membership today is approximately 70% either non-free, according to Freedom House's annual survey, or partly free. They're basically an assortment of outright dictatorships and other forms of authoritarian or partially authoritarian regimes. We're talking about only approximately 30% that are democracies. So bear in mind, the vote against Iran was great. It got 25 out of 47. That was unexpected. And that had to pull in various countries that are not democracies, but which oppose Iran for one reason or other. Libya being an example. It's not a democracy, but it voted for the resolution. Look, the UNHRC has been suffering from this from the beginning. It was designed as a reform in 2006 after Gaddafi's Libyan regime was chair of the old Human Rights Commission. The 2006 creation of the council was designed as a reform. On the membership issue, it has largely failed. To be precise, the nominations are technically made by an individual country. Any individual country can nominate itself, but in practice, it is true that the regional groups sort of do dirty deals behind the scenes to produce what's called a closed slate. So if there's only 3 seats available for the Latin American group, typically, thankfully, it didn't happen this time, and that's why Venezuela lost. But in the past, Cuba would make sure that there'd be no competition. There'd be 3 seats open and 3 candidates put forward and none others. You mentioned Asia. That's an example where there was some competition. And that's the only reason that a country can lose is if there is no competition. In terms of the reform going forward, in my opinion, the way to solve the crisis that we have is a crisis of credibility when you have so many dictatorships. The members of the Human Rights Council, and you mentioned some of them, they include China, Cuba, Libya, Eritrea, Venezuela. We spearheaded the successful effort to remove Vladimir Putin back in April, and thankfully the Czech Republic took their place, which is great. but it includes many authoritarian regimes and dictatorships. Kazakhstan is another. In my opinion, the best way is not necessarily an institutional check, because I don't think we're at a constitutional moment to impose that. It's hard to know who guards the guardians and who would determine what the threshold is. But at a minimum, Senator, at a minimum, our democracies need to speak out and fight. Too often, that has not been the case. When China, Russia, and Cuba ran a couple of years ago in Venezuela, no country spoke out. They may have done some things behind the scenes, but no one spoke out. And Russia was elected. The United States did not speak out publicly. The European Union did not speak out. Basically, no one spoke out, and this happens repeatedly. So at a minimum, what we need to see is for our democracies to speak out and lobby and to make sure that there is competition, to encourage countries in Asia, in Africa, to put their names forward and to assure them that the free world will support their candidacies. I believe that is something that happened with Venezuela. This time, Costa Rica ran against Venezuela, and Venezuela was defeated. That did not happen in the past. So I think our democracies can organize effectively to speak out, to campaign, to encourage competition, and that would be an effective solution to improving the membership of a body that was initially chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Fawcett, and thank you, Mr. Neuer, for your evidence today. Members of the committee can provide questions to you to respond to on notice, and they will be due back. Responses will be due back by Monday, the 12th of December 2022. But we will now dismiss you and welcome witnesses from Amnesty International Australia, and Human Rights Watch. Thank you.
I'll be back in about 15 minutes.
And we have a very flashy camera from Ms. White.
Apologies for that. I do think I can fix that. Thank you very much for having us. You did see my face perfectly.
That's all right. I now welcome Ms. Nikita White from Amnesty International Australia, and Ms. Tara Saperi Farr and Ms. Sophie McNeil from Human Rights Watch. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Senator Claire Chandler and I'm the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by Senator Ciccone, the deputy chair, Senator Steele-John and Senator Fawcett, who I believe will be back shortly. For the Hansard record, could you each please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? And we'll start with the witnesses from Amnesty International.
Nikita White, and I'm a campaigner at Amnesty International Australia.
Thank you. And from Human Rights Watch?
My name is Tara Saperi Farr, and I'm a senior researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, based in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. And Ms. McNeil?
Sophie McNeil, Australia researcher, Human Rights Watch.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, if anyone requires opening statements, we will ask you to keep them to a couple of minutes and table other comments. But again, I'll start with Amnesty International. Do you have an opening statement?
We have tabled our opening statement, so I'm happy to be quite brief. I think most members of the committee are aware of our concerns about what is happening in Iran today and what has happened for a number of years in Iran in response to protest and that violent crackdown on protests, which is leading to the deaths of people who are simply exercising their rights to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly. And we are very concerned with the path that the authorities have taken in response to these protests. Unfortunately, this path is characteristic, the use of unlawful force, particularly of live ammunition, the arrest and detention of thousands of people, and the torture and ill treatment of people in detention. And in recent days, we have reported on the imposition of charges that involve the death penalty on a number of people, and that a number of people have been charged with corruption on earth and other charges with which they face the death penalty, and some people have been sentenced to death. And we are very concerned with this progress. We welcome the fact-finding mission that was established last week by the Human Rights Council, and particularly welcome Australia's support for that fact-finding mission. We think this is a really important step for accountability and for international scrutiny on Iran and Iran's human rights abuses, particularly because it gives us an opportunity to collect evidence that can be used for future prosecutions. But there is still more that needs to be done and that can be done, particularly to halt the response to these protests and the violence. But I am happy to answer questions after. I'll pass over to Human Rights Watch.
Thanks, Ms White. Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we were told there was no time for opening statements, so we have tabled ours, but I echo everything that our colleagues at Amnesty have said. We have made some specific recommendations that we would like to see the Australian government take to hold the Iranian authorities accountable. And just like to point out that my colleague Tara is our Iran researcher. She's devoted, her full-time work to documenting what is happening on the ground in Iran, and we really welcome the opportunity to answer all your questions today about the latest on what's happening there, but also how Australia can do more to stand with the people of Iran and hold the regime accountable.
Thank you very much, Ms McNeil. I'll ask my first questions to Amnesty International then. We had a bit of feedback on the mics, that's all good. According to your submission, Amnesty International has seen evidence that journalists, activists and other prisoners in Iran are being tortured, abused and sexually harassed, and you've seen evidence of security forces shooting at unarmed civilians. Could you please provide the committee with a verbal summary of what that looks like and what your views and experiences have been in terms of what's happening in Iran? Ms White.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
For journalists and for others who report on human rights abuses and who report on the actions of the authorities in Iran for years have faced incredible crackdowns, and particularly being charged and sent to prison for reporting on the authorities' actions. What we've witnessed in the last few weeks has been a ramping up of that crackdown, particularly that journalists have been targeted for reporting on the authorities' response to the protests, as have their families. If their journalists are overseas, some of their families in Iran have been targeted. And in the last few weeks, the Iranian authorities are estimated to have rounded up 15,000 protesters. And those include journalists as well as people who've just taken to the streets, taken part in protests. The other aspect of this crackdown that I think impacts on journalists, but also on any Iranian's ability to talk about what is happening, has been the shutdown of the internet. And this is something the Iranian authorities have done often in recent years in response to protests, but particularly in the last few weeks, is to shut down the internet so that people cannot report to the international community on what is happening. And particularly for the community in Australia, they also cannot hear from their family in Iran on whether they're safe, on what has been happening. So we're really concerned with the arrests of journalists, with the harassment of journalists and their families, and also this internet crackdown and what that means for getting information out of Iran, and also for the community, for them to know that their family and friends are safe.
Thank you very much, Ms White. And to Human Rights Watch, you support the use of targeted sanctions on individuals and entities involved in and responsible for the violence and human rights abuses in Iran. How important is it that Australia and other nations match those sanctions implemented by other countries so that there's a consistent message being sent to human rights abusers?
I'm happy to answer that. As iterated in our submission, we do think one of the actions that the international community can take is designating individuals and entities that are responsible for current crackdown protesters as very serious human rights violations that are being committed. It's particularly, sanctions can be much more effective if they're applied multilaterally and across the board. But we would like to stress that for designating any entity beyond just individual designation, it is important for for states to take a careful look at assessing any potential negative impact on ordinary Iranians and ensure that human rights of Iranians are at the center of any actions that are being taken to empower them against the repressive.
Thank you very much. Deputy Chair, you have the call.
Thanks a lot, Chair, and also welcome to our witnesses. Can I just turn to Amnesty International? One of your recommendations was for the Australian Government to support and advocate for the establishment of an independent fact-finding mechanism into the human rights violations in Iran. From your point of view, why was this so important?
I think this was so important because there has been a crisis of impunity in Iran for decades where people responsible for human rights abuses, including what we believe to be international crimes, are not held accountable for those abuses. They are not even investigated. There is no opportunity for independent investigation leading to accountability in Iran today. And for these reasons, we've called for a fact-finding mission in Iran for a number of years. And where we believe this, obviously, organizations like Amnesty International do not have access to Iran, and we have only limited information about what is happening on the ground today. So, for example, we know our reporting on the deaths of protesters that we can only report on a limited number because we can only report on what we can document. So a fact-finding mission has the power to investigate independently these abuses in a much more comprehensive way than has happened for decades. And that increases scrutiny on those responsible for abuses in Iran. It also provides a mechanism for collecting evidence that can be used for future prosecutions. And I think this is particularly important for two reasons. One is a number of states have already exercised universal justice in relation to human rights abuses in Iran, particularly Belgium and Sweden, who have held hearings against former Iranian officials who were involved in massacres in prison. And that is one way of solving this crisis of accountability. But it also allows us to use to access justice at the international level. So we saw in relation to the fact-finding mission on Myanmar that has led to a case at the International Court of Justice against the Myanmar authorities for their atrocity crimes, in this case genocide. So there is important, this fact-finding mission is important because it makes a dent in that crisis of impunity and makes steps forward for accountability.
Yeah, indeed. And I do note that Australia, I think, was an early co-sponsor of the UN Human Rights Council's resolution to establish a fact-finding mission to investigate these human rights violations. Could I also ask you which community groups in Iran are most vulnerable in terms of the human rights violations by the Iranian regime? I know that follows on from some of the line of questioning from the chair, but I was hoping you might be able to expand on that for me.
Absolutely. So we've documented particularly harsh repression of protests against Kurdish people, areas where there are Kurdish majorities, and noting that Mahsa Jina Amini was a Kurdish woman. And also in Baluchistan, we've noted a particularly harsh response. In general, the Iranian authorities have a history of discrimination against Kurdish people, other ethnic minority and religious groups like the Baha'i people. And we've also documented, in terms of their response to these protests, particular concerns related to the treatment of women, particularly with women who are removing their hijab at these protests, that they are being arrested, some have been beaten. If they are arrested, they face ill treatment and torture, and particularly concerning reports of sexual violence being used against women who take part in these protests.
So what's the situation that's been faced by many members of the Iranian community, particularly those of the LGBTQIA+ community?
Absolutely. So it is a very concerning situation, and it is discrimination on every aspect of people's lives if they are LGBTQIA+. We're particularly concerned in recent years with honour killings that have happened against members of the LGBTQIA+ community, and that there has been no investigation from the Iranian authorities into these killings, into their deaths. And we've also followed the case quite recently of some LGBTQIA+ rights defenders who have been imprisoned for being human rights defenders, for standing up for the LGBTQIA+ community, and have now been sentenced to death under the charges of corruption on earth. So those are two things we're particularly concerned about for the LGBTQIA+ community in Iran.
Sorry, just so I was clear, I guess my last question was about what punishments are associated with being gay, trans or queer in Iran, but could you go over that line you just spoke about the punishments that are associated?
So this is in relation to rights defenders, LGBTQIA+ rights defenders, that two of them this year have been charged with corruption on earth, which is also something some of the protesters have been charged with, and they have now been sentenced to death. And we believe those charges are purely stemming from their defence of LGBTQIA+ rights.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. Senator Steele-John.
Thanks very much, Chair. This is a question for both Amnesty and for Human Rights Watch. Both of your submissions to the inquiry list recommendations in relation to what Australia can do in terms of accepting people that may need safe harbour, fleeing the protests or would be at risk if they returned to Iran. Amnesty lists a recommendation that Australia should increase the number of humanitarian visas for at-risk Iranians and prioritise family reunions, and Human Rights Watch talks about granting permanency to those already in Australia on temporary visas. Can I ask you about both? First of all, do you have an idea of how many, if Australia took the step of granting permanency to those on temporary visas, how many members of the community would be protected by such a step?
Ms McNeill, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, Senator, that was actually Amnesty's recommendation. It was just the reverse there. So we recommend increasing the number of humanitarian visas for Iranians at risk and to prioritise family reunions. I can get back to you on the exact numbers, but we do believe that there are currently thousands of members in the community who aren't on permanent visas, and we know that there are Iranians currently in our offshore and onshore detention system.
Okay, thank you.
I'll also take it on notice and come back to you with the exact numbers, but similar to what Sophie said, that is particularly in relation to people on temporary protection visas and people in on and offshore detention we know who are Iranian and who have to constantly reapply for humanitarian visas and for safety and are on bridging visas. And obviously we know now that they cannot be safely returned to Iran. So we would like that they are granted permanent safety in Australia.
Okay, thank you. And if you'd also be able to, if you've got any information on how many people might be able to be supported if the step around prioritisation of family reunions was also taken, because it's a call that we support, and I'd like to get a clear idea of actually how many people would benefit from both of those actions. Human Rights Watch also has a recommendation around ensuring that investigators within the Australian Federal Police and Home Affairs tasked with investigating foreign interference also investigate and document the scale of harassment, intimidation and surveillance of the Iranian diaspora community. Could you expand a little bit for us on why you believe that is an important step?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, we have done a lot of work on foreign interference in Australia. It's been alarming in recent weeks to see these reports coming from the Iranian community. We've seen the worst consequences reportedly impacting family members back in Iran. So Iranians who speak out, appear at rallies here, who are active on social media criticizing the regime, that then their families back home suffer consequences, rather than some other communities where we've seen, the harassment and intimidation directly impact the dissidents themselves here in Australia. But we are concerned that that could be the next step, and we think it's incredibly important that the government ensure that Home Affairs allocate the necessary resources, particularly the AFP, ensure that the embassy knows that this will not be tolerated. But we think that the strong accountability measures from the Australian government will help send that strong message. So we welcome the opportunity to talk about our recommendations on the sanctions, and Tara can talk about what other countries have done and the exact entities that we believe should be targeted.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Tara, would you like to talk about what other countries have done with the sanctions?
We don't have the list of exact entities. We do encourage a very specific, transparent due diligence process for designating individuals as well as entities. In relation to the conversation that was brought up earlier with regards to designating Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, an example of countries that have dealt with it in order to mitigate potential harm on those who do not choose to serve with the force has been the example of Canada. Canadian government recently announced that they're looking into designating large number of official forces from IRGC, but have not taken the step to designate as an entity in order to mitigate the impact. So this is an example of looking into bringing accountability while being mindful of the potential impact. The list of Revolutionary Court judges as well as entities that are directly responsible for unlawful use of force that several human rights groups have gathered, and I'm sure it would be made available upon request if there is an interest. But again, anything beyond individual designation, we do think it's important to look into the potential harm and take things into account. And other governments have demonstrated that it's possible to take actions while taking those into consideration.
Okay, so just to be clear, and I think we're absolutely on the same page. You would recommend sanctions, but only in the cases where they can be targeted to avoid collateral damage and harm to the broader community in Iran.
That is correct.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Steele-John. And if no other committee members have further questions, I will thank Amnesty International Australia and Human Rights Watch for appearing today. I think we did have a couple of questions taken on notice, and the due date for the return of those responses is Monday, the 12th of December 2022. Thank you very much, and we'll bring in our next witnesses, please. as Mr Gregory's there. He looks like he's there. Okay. They've all tabled opening statements. Wonderful. We now have a panel of community groups, and I'd like to thank you all for appearing today. For those listening along at home, I'm sure everyone recognises and understands that we received a lot of interest from different community groups to appear today, but this is by no means the first hearing that we will be having, so the committee certainly looks forward to hearing from other community groups throughout the course of the inquiry. But to those who are here today, thank you very much for coming along. We have Ms Sarah Rafi and Mr Faraz Magami of the United Action for Iran. We have Ms Tara Fatehi from the Kurdish National Committee of Australia. We have Ms Shepherly Williams from the Australian Baha'i Community, and on teleconference Mr Robert Gregory from the Australian Jewish Association. Thank you for your time. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. My name is Senator Claire Chandler. I'm the chair of this inquiry. We are also joined today by Senator Ciccone, the deputy chair, and Senator Steele-John. For the Hansard record, would you please each state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? And I will start with the witnesses from United Action for Iran.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Sarah Rafi. I'm appearing for and on behalf of United Action for Iran.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, my name is Faraz Magami. I appear in my professional capacity as a representative for and on behalf of UIA.
Wonderful. We'll go to Ms Williams next.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator. My name is Shefali Williams, and I'm appearing for the Australian Baha'i community.
Thank you very much. Ms Fateh.
Yes, my name is Tara Fateh, and I'm here as an executive member of the Kurdish National Committee of Australia.
Great. And lucky last, Mr Gregory.
My name is Robert Gregory, and I'm appearing as the Public Affairs Director for and on behalf of the Australian Jewish Association.
Thank you very much. I understand that you've all been asked to table your opening statements, except Ms Fateh. So if you wanted to make an opening statement, you certainly can, but in the interest of time, we are just trying to keep things as brief as possible so we can get to questions. Thank you. Ms Fateh, did you want to make any opening comments?
If that's okay, I'll try and keep it brief.
Thank you.
I'm here today as a Kurdish woman from Iran, just like Gina Amini, and I make this statement on behalf of the brave people of Kurdistan currently under heavy military siege by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Kurdish people have never accepted this regime and have fought against their dictatorship for the past 43 years and are today spearheading, under a deliberate and systematic targeting of their people, the Jian Azadi revolution. I dedicate this to them, and I am wearing my red Kurdish clothes today to honour Gina's life. The voice and identity of the minoritised people of Iran, such as the Kurds and the Baloch, has been largely ignored and erased from broader reporting on the protest movement and its discourse. This is despite the fact that the regime's response takes its most extreme form in the Kurdish and minority regions. The scale of military assaults on the Kurds and the Baloch cannot be seen anywhere else. The situation is escalating so rapidly that our submission is already outdated. In the last week alone, the Islamic Republic of Iran has systematically targeted the Kurdish regions of Iran, unleashing military-grade weapons on defenceless civilians and innocent bystanders. They have killed so many men, women, and children that we are clambering to keep up with the latest numbers. They are raiding people's homes, they are abducting hundreds of citizens whose whereabouts are still unknown, terrorising families, destroying their belongings, and confiscating their mobile phones, leaving people without a means to communicate or document the human rights abuses. This is no longer a case of a crackdown on protesters. I do not use this term lightly, but this is by every definition of the word mounting to ethnic genocide. This systematic targeting of the Kurdish people includes the bombing of Iranian Kurdish opposition parties and their nearby camps located outside of Iran, across the border, again targeting innocent civilians, including schools and hospitals. The youngest victim was an unborn child. in his mother's womb. He was delivered alive, and 24 hours later, after his mother has also passed, he tragically lost his life. In the last 7 days alone, the Kurdish cities of Sanandaj, Mahabat, Juanro, Mariwan, Kermashan, Ilam, Piranshar, Sardasht, Bana and Borkan have had their electricity cut, water cut, internet cut. Reports are coming in of water and food supplies being poisoned, the use of machine guns, recent reports of the use of nerve gas. And this is all being compounded by the lack of medical supplies in the region, hospitals being blocked by military personnel, the abduction of dead bodies, and not allowing families to hold burial services for their loved ones. I want to draw the committee's attention to a recent CNN report which revealed the absolute horrific victim testimonies illustrating how Iran's security forces routinely use rape and sexual abuse and torture to quell protests. The report states, and I quote, "Most of the reports of sexual violence reviewed by CNN since the protests sparked by Amini's death began came from the west of the country, where large swathes of the region are predominantly Kurdish." The report states that despite the risks of reporting these claims, the incidents CNN learned about and corroborated almost all occurred in Kurdish regions. I will save this inquiry from the horrific details of the report, except to share this one story, where CNN received the audio testimony of a 17-year-old boy who said he and his friends were raped and electrocuted in detention after they were arrested in the protests. And this is merely the beginning. As former Kurdish refugees, our community is re-traumatised every single day as we watch the regime deliberately target our families, our brothers, sisters, aunties and uncles. Every day we wake up and scroll through the confirmed names of the dead from the night before, looking for the names of our families and their faces. Whilst we watch the media and our representatives and most of the world commentary re-erase us from the discourse on the human rights violations being committed in Iran. A special thank you to the Jewish community across Australia who have stood firmly with the Kurdish people in the Middle East, although never a popular position. Your solidarity doesn't go unnoticed and your presence here today is appreciated. Lastly, I want to thank the Australian Government and this committee for giving us a platform to bring you the voices of Kurdistan, too often ignored.
Thank you. That was incredibly moving. Ms. Fateh.
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to go and vote now, and then I will come back. Thank you.
Did any other witnesses want to make additions to their opening statements? Ms. Rafi, I saw you put your hand up. Thank you.
I will keep it brief.
And thank you. And Mr. Gregory as well. Great. Ms. Rafi, you first.
Thank you. Thank you for having this inquiry. My name is Sarah Rafi. As I mentioned, Mr. Magami and I are appearing for and on behalf of United Action for Iran. Given the fact that UAI is not a standalone entity and is a cooperative of approximately 19 Iranian Australian community organisations and approximately 700 individuals, I thought I should make that clear. All views expressed today are my own and not in my professional capacity or my day job. The UAI submission sets out 6 proposed actions that the Australian government could and should take in dealing with the situation in Iran. I will happily address some of those and Mr. Magami the rest. From the outset, it is important to note what we are not asking for. We're not asking for any military intervention and we're not asking for broad-based economic sanctions for reasons explained in the submission. By way of a very short background, I'm an Iranian Australian, was born in Iran and migrated here with my family when I was 15. Currently, the internet is restricted and information is disseminated on a piecemeal basis. Despite this, through bravery of Iranians, we are seeing images get out via mobile phone networks where possible and usually days late. These videos come out at a very high price. On 22 September, a young woman was shot by the regime forces when she was recording gunfire crackdown on protesters. The images that come out of Iran show unlawful and unjustified use of firearms, including live ammunition, causing death and serious injuries, including blindness and paralysis. The number of protesters injured in this way is currently unknown due to absence of free press. The regime has imposed pressure and punishment on Iranian doctors simply for providing medical care to injured protesters, including arrest and arbitrary detention. Since 16 September, mass protests are widespread across the country. The rallying cause is summarised in 3 words: women, life, freedom. The regime continues to suppress and violate the human rights of its citizens, especially women and girls, as it has for 43 years. For the past 43 years, systematic abuse has occurred and no one has been spared. Human rights advocates, labour rights activists, LGBTQI+ activists, lawyers, environmentalists, journalists, bloggers, filmmakers, and especially ethnic and religious minorities. The Iranian regime is a gender apartheid regime with women bearing the brunt. There is discrimination in all walks of life, including divorce, custody rights, work, travel, inheritance. Women cannot be appointed as judges of high courts, enter sporting events, leave the country without permission of husband or their father. Even the simple act of riding a bicycle, they are prohibited from under Iranian law. In 2019, an Iranian female set herself on fire as a show of protest after being handed a prison sentence for trying to enter a soccer stadium. There are many, many, many more examples, but plain and simple, what has been happening in Iran over the past 43 years is the very definition of gender apartheid. In seeking to downplay the atrocities of the regime against its own people, it labels peaceful protesters as violent rioters, as if that excuses the extrajudicial killings on the streets of Iran and the denial of the most basic rights to Iranians by the regime. The figures have already been covered by Amnesty earlier today, so I will not repeat them, except to say that approximately 16,000 people have been arrested and are in limbo, not knowing whether they'll get a trumped-up charge that carries the death penalty. The regime regularly engages in acts of terrorism, including through its cyber armies, with Australia a victim, something that has been confirmed by our very own security agencies here in Australia only 2 months ago. So none of this is far from home. We must treat the Iranian regime the same way we treated apartheid South Africa. We need to diplomatically isolate and shame it. Diplomatic action is necessary to fulfil Australia's human rights policy objectives and ensure the safety of Australians by firmly shutting Australia out from serving a safe haven to members and supporters of the Iranian regime, as well as other perpetrators of human rights abuses and atrocities in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Magami, did you have anything to add to that?
Madam Chair, if you would indulge me, I might say some remarks in closing.
Thank you.
And then I can promise you that I've timed myself to less than 90 seconds.
Very good.
But if I can come back to it towards the end, at the end.
Okay. Mr Gregory, did you have any additional comments to make beyond your opening statement, which has been tabled?
A very brief comment.
Thank you.
And the rest just be tabled. I just want to thank the senators for hearing about this very important issue. We've been contacted by several people who've shared some terrible experiences, imprisonment under the Iranian regime, truly shocking stories. I'm representing the Australian Jewish Association, which is a membership-based Jewish communal organisation, largest Jewish organisation in Australia in terms of engagement, social media following. And a particular area we can speak about is Iranian human rights abuses against the Jewish community. It's something we've known about for a long time. The Iranian Revolution has hanged many Jewish people on trumped-up charges. The community, 150,000 people. It's now a tiny remnant, less than 5% of that. Jewish sites around the world, as we've heard earlier this morning, have been targeted by Iranian terrorist groups directed by the IRCG. We've had in Argentina, in Bulgaria, in our region, in Thailand. One of the reasons that in Australia, Jewish preschools, synagogues, and our community centres, you may have noticed they're protected by armed guards. It's from a fear of the Iranian regime sponsors terrorist organisations. And in our submission, obviously, and we're hearing today, there's many groups targeted, LGBT groups are treated horribly, the Baha'i people, and outside of Iran's borders, the regime is leaving a devastation in its wake. The brutal attack on Salman Rushdie came after Iran's fatwa on his head. That week, there were several attempted terrorist attacks killed in the United States. We can just look from Yemen to Syria, Lebanon to Iraq. We're seeing wherever Iran is, wherever the IRGC is, they're causing problems. Iran's one of the few countries to stand with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Iran's ambassador was recently expelled from Ukraine after Iranian suicide drones and missiles are terrorizing the civilians in Kiev. Albania has also expelled Iran's ambassador recently because of cyber hacking. This issue has also affected Australia. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the ACSC, issued a warning about Iranian government-sponsored cyber attacks targeting Australian infrastructure, but we haven't seen any further action from the Australian government. So AJA strongly believes that Australia should be following our allies and that we must take robust action against Iranian human rights violations. Ideas like sanctions on individuals may feel like they're accomplishing something, but in our opinion, most of these individuals don't have business ties in Australia, and if they did, they've had so much time now that they would have, made other arrangements. So we've outlined 3 areas we think would have the greatest impact in signalling Australian displeasure with Iranian human rights violations, and one of those, as we've also been hearing today, is the IRGC. It's prescribing it as a terrorist organization, putting sanctions on it. The sole purpose of this group is to preserve the Iranian revolution. We think that by distinguishing this from the military, that can provide a strong signal that the IRGC is what's directing a lot of these attacks, a lot of these human rights violations. We think that sanctions on entities like the Morality Police and Iran's drone exports should of course be done, but they're unlikely to have the largest impact. Other issues we've raised is the fact that in 2010, Australia closed its trade office in Iran. However, in 2016, it was reopened with the hope that Iran had moderated its behavior. Clearly, this hasn't happened. We think, there's a question whether Australia should maintain an embassy in Iran, but if it chooses to do that, certainly there doesn't need to be a huge focus on trade with this regime. It can be kept for diplomatic purposes and other purposes, keep the lines of communication open. And lastly, the last thing we raised in our submission is we've been in contact with different information about educational ties between Australian universities and Iranian universities. Some apparently are sanctioned universities, so that are under United States sanctions. One where it's been alleged the Morality Police have been trained at an extremist university. Obviously, these are potentially inappropriate connections to be making. DFAT has a list of agreements between Australian universities and Iranian universities. And following us raising these concerns publicly, we were contacted by an Iranian woman who claimed she was bullied by regime loyalists at an Australian university when they found out she had a Jewish background. She claims the people were involved with the Iranian regime in Iran before they came to Australia. And this particular person, she alleges, still occupies a senior role at an Australian university. So we're urging a thorough investigation of the benefits and the risks regarding these Australian-Iranian educational ties. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gregory. Oh, thank you. Ms. Williams, did you have any additions to make to your opening statement?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
I'll be like Mr. Magami, 90 seconds.
Very good.
It is a sorry state, but the history of the Baha'is is the same as what their fellow countrymen and women are going through. Baha'is know all too well what it is to be detained on false charges, interrogated, mistreated, detained without due process, their ancestral lands taken away from them, and living in fear for their loved ones, all because of what they believe in. This desire for justice and equality is not exclusive to Baha'is, and recent events have made it clear that the Iranian people wish for an end to discrimination and prejudice and want justice and equality for all. They are making a call for an end to discrimination on any basis. They are rejecting a society built on untruths and the emergence of the young and their desire to see principles of integrity, justice, peace, and unity can be seen. Our community here in Australia want that all citizens of Iran, Baha'is and others, should be able to live peacefully and with security, and all have the opportunity to contribute constructively to their society, regardless of their religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds. We leave specific measures such as sanctions to government, but observe that the Iranian authorities are mindful of their country's standing and international opinion, especially when it is united and widely held. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Megami.
I had hoped to say it at the end of, or towards the end of the hearing, if that's okay.
Sure. I
If
thought
you would
meant-
please, Ms. Chair, I am.
Oh, no, that's more than all right.
I'd be grateful.
We'll keep 90 seconds aside for you at the end. I wasn't sure if you wanted it just at the end of opening
No,
statements.
thank you.
But we'll move then to questions.
Yes.
And I do have a couple for United Action on Iran. We're hearing very concerning reports of intimidation and threats against Iranian Australians. There's a genuine fear in the community about the reach of the regime, isn't there?
The short answer is, if I can cover this, the short answer is yes. A report was made available in public, and I think the first time we went public was when Senator Penny Wong made it public in the Senate, where the security agencies of Australia have briefed the Minister and others, I suspect, of the direct and indirect interference, to be frank, with that democratic process. By way of some examples, and I'll perhaps ask Sarah to cover this because she knows about this more than I, but there are individuals connected to the Iranian regime who turn up to protests and film individuals there. There's a point that we'll come to in a minute, but one of the reasons behind the suggestion, or the submission rather, that the Iranian embassy, or there be serious consideration given to the closing of the Iranian embassy, is because the Iranian embassies around the world are not pure embassies as we know them, not like ours. They are a hub of intelligence gathering, and ultimately what's been shown is they operate as the extended arm of the regime to quell, illegally, by the laws of this country, any dissent. And when I say dissent, I don't mean political dissent necessarily. When people say stop killing children, that's seen as dissent. When people say stop hurting religious minorities, that's seen as dissent. And that is, I think, the longer answer to your very crisp question, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And so this intimidation, specifically in Australia, you believe that is connected to the regime and its intelligence services as well?
I would be speculating if I gave an affirmative, but can I say this, that CSIS, the Canadian Secret Service, made public about 3 weeks ago in very specific detail, and I suspect the appropriate director in Australia would have a better answer on this. But CSIS in Canada made very clear that the Iranian intelligence arm, not just supporters of the regime, but the Iranian intelligence arm in Canada were abusing their diplomatic rights and doing what they could, I don't think they used the word attack, but interfere with the democratic processes in Canada. And I suspect if I were a betting man, which I'm not, it's the same position in Australia.
Has your organisation or representatives of your organisation been given a specific contact or a liaison officer within the AFP or other authorities to report these concerns to?
The short answer is no. I think Ms. Rafi made it clear. The UIA is a collective of about 19 organisations. So the UIA is not an independent organisation itself. It's a collective of 19 Iranian Australian organisations and about 700 individuals. I would have to take that on notice and come back with a firm answer, but as I understand my instructions this morning, the answer is no, we haven't.
I do have another couple of questions, but I'm wary of sharing the call around, so I might go to the Deputy Chair now.
Thanks, Chair. Just to pick up on the Chair's line of questioning just there, best of your knowledge around the AFP, but has Home Affairs, the Department of Home Affairs, been in contact?
Again, that's a matter that I should take on point and come back to, if you allow me, Deputy Chair. But the short answer is there are individuals that we are aware of, and I should just put in parentheses for a moment, I'm a barrister and Ms Rafi is a solicitor, so we get contacted by members of the UAI saying, what can we do? And I can, from personal experience, say that I've been contacted multiple times by Iranian Australians who've said, I've received the message, and to quote one, we're going to put you in a body bag and send you home. And this was a lady of a relatively senior commercial position, banking position in Sydney. So I think to answer your question, there are aspects, but I don't think there are specific contacts with Home Affairs.
My understanding is there is a community network and they are engaging with the community
Yes.
and I believe also the various states and territories as well too. But if you could just take that on notice.
Of course.
If I could also just turn to asking, I guess, to the panel as well, how can the Australian government offer more support in the communities that are facing these threats here in Australia, the intimidation, the filming, etc. I'd be interested just to get a sense from you today, how can we as a government offer more support?
Okay. I understand that there's a lot of diplomatic sensitivities here, and it's a lot more black and white than what we would like it to be. But if I had to say anything, I would say that if resources could be increased or strengthened within DFAT to recognise and identify these individuals. I mean, we've been dealing with it for 43 years. We've had Kurdish community activists, members, leaders of opposition political parties assassinated outside of Iran, across Europe. So this isn't something new, but with the increased threat, my ask of the Australian government would be to strengthen DFAT's resources in any way possible to identify these individuals and maybe do something about them.
I guess my question is more domestic, but I appreciate the
domestically.
the forestry, but domestically here in Australia.
Domestically, these individuals that are turning up to these protests.
Because it's fair to say they're also targeting the Kurdish community as well too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For 43 years, this isn't something that just has happened over the last 2 months. We've been dealing with this for a long time. Of course, it's ramped up in the last 2 months, but I guess their resources are also run thin because now they're not just targeting the Kurdish community, they have to target, we're all standing here asking for the regime to go. So, but that would be the ask, is these individuals in Australia, who are they and why are they able to just roam around intimidating innocent citizens?
Did any of the other witnesses want to say something? Mr. Gregory?
I might just add, one issue that's been raised with us is whether diplomats have diplomatic community to take in packages and things like that without getting it checked, whether that is a concern when we know perhaps in other countries in the world there's been allegations that Iranian diplomats have abused those privileges to take in explosives and do things. And the other thing I'll just briefly mention is, and I'm sure it's the same for all the targeted communities, the Jewish community spends an enormous amount of its budget on security costs, so that's always a concern for us, just securing religious and minority groups, institutions from threats such as this.
I guess from the committee's point of view, I mean, what do you think we should consider and I guess respond to these concerns? Because no doubt when we table our report to the Parliament, everyone will be eager to see what our recommendations are. But given you're here today, what would you like us, if I could turn that question around to you and say, well, what would you like us to do in terms of our recommendations, not just to government, but also to others in the community? What are you hoping to expect out of this process?
Is the question posed on a general basis or specifically in relation to threats?
Take it as you want, but
Sure.
the threats as well too.
In the submission set out by the UAI, and I suspect you have a copy in front of you, the imposition of the Magnitsky-style sanctions and also the declaration of the IRGC. Can I touch on those very quickly in short compass? And I'm happy to either come back to you in writing with further material or otherwise. I have always advocated for the path of least resistance when it comes to this sort of thing, and I understand that diplomacy is best done behind closed doors. But the path of least resistance, that is, what can the Australian government do today without any controversy, legal controversy, is the imposition of targeted sanction under the Magnitsky legislation which came in November 2021, I'm reminded. It came in, I don't want to say for the Russians, but due to what happened between Russia and the Ukraine. But can I make this point clear? The security agencies of this country can readily identify bad actors. We have no doubt they can do that. Once those bad actors are identified, the question for the minister is then whether or not sanctions should be applied to those individuals. So when I say the path of least resistance, I mean that in the legalistic sense. That is, once identification has been had in relation to a particular person who might be in fact covered under the diplomatic immunity functions because they work for the Iranian regime in the embassy, but once those individuals are identified, it is then, obviously there needs to be a briefing, but it is then the decision of the minister to in fact impose those sanctions, which then allows the government to take actions including the freezing of assets or otherwise.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
If I may add one more point as
Sure.
well, just going back to what Mr. Bagami said earlier, if you look at all the submissions that are submitted, and it's quite telling the number of people who have made submissions under name withheld, which shows the amount of fear that exists in the Australian community. I mean, we're talking about living in Australia, and I would say 98% of the submissions are under name withheld. So that's quite telling. That shows the fear that's prevailing in Australian society, unfortunately. And to add to what Mr. Magami said, one of the main things that we're looking at, which is included as part of our submission, is closing off the Iranian embassy, because it is a hub for intelligence gathering by the Iranian regime. And that's one of the things we're looking at, apart from extra protections that you recommended in terms of AFP increasing its resources and DFAT, as Ms. Fateh said as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Fawcett, did you want to make a quick comment?
Yeah, just to the issue, and this is for any of the members of the community. This committee did an inquiry in late 2020 into issues affecting diaspora communities, ranging from a number of totalitarian states that were reaching out and seeking to influence and coerce members of the community. That was tabled in February, I think, of 2021. And one of the key recommendations the committee made was there should be a dedicated point for diaspora communities to connect with the government. But as I understand it, the extant point of contact is still the National Security Hotline, which was 1800 123 400. And I'd encourage anyone who does have any of those coercive kind of contacts to contact that number to report it. It is anonymous. As in the details never made public, but what it does is give the agencies a brief, if you like, of the number of times this is occurring, so they can actually track patterns of behaviour and target down to individuals to take action. So I'd encourage you to use that resource which is available.
Thanks, Senator Fawcett. Senator Steele-John.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you so much for the evidence that you've given this afternoon. I want to go, first of all, to the UAI submission. Now, in responding to the situation in Iran so far, the Greens have taken a couple of steps which I think have been reflected in the evidence that you've given around the listing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation, the application of Magnitsky-style sanctions, and the removal of Iran from the Committee on the Status of Women. We have purposely not taken the step of calling for any kind of broad-based economic sanctions or any type of military intervention, and I see here in your submission that you've taken that same position as well. Could you share with us why you believe those two things are steps that Australia shouldn't take?
I might defer to Ms. Rafi on the CSW. Oh, sure. I'm replying. I think I've touched on the Magnitsky approach. Can I perhaps briefly touch on the IRGC, known to Iranians as SEPA? SEPA is not your traditional armed forces. There is a suggestion by my colleague, Professor Ben Saul, who's appearing, I think, in the next session, that IRGC, being an extension of the arm of the government of Iran, will potentially not fit within the definition under the criminal code, so you can't designate the IRGC in its entirety. As a matter of legal analysis, that is probably correct, that the IRGC is an extension of the arm of government of Iran. What is not clear to perhaps outsiders is this, that SEPA is not, or the IRGC are not your traditional form of military arm. They have investments within and outside of Iran. They have banks. They run schools. They run universities. They run basically the social security system. Part of it, the Mostazafan Group, which is for the downtrodden, I think the bad translation with my Farsi to English, the downtrodden organization which SEPA pays a weekly or monthly stipend to. These are all independent and individual organizations which are connected to the IRGC. That means, in short, in my view, they can and in fact do fall within the parameters of the Act currently. So upon briefing and consideration by the government, they can be designated as terrorist organizations. Now, I suspect Professor Ben Saul will have further things to say about that, but can I perhaps provide one last point on this, and that is this. Even if it is the case that the IRGC is an extension of the arm of the government, and whilst I've set out all these individual parts, individual entities which can be in fact designated, all it requires is a slight legislative amendment. The difficulty that we face is this, that there is a decision, an intermediary decision in South Australia and in Obiter by the Chief Justice, where he says words to the effect of, an organisation as defined does not include governments or arms thereof. I'm paraphrasing badly. That hasn't been decided to finality, but on the assumption that is the correct interpretation, which I think it probably might be, the legislative amendment is quite simple. That is, the definition is widened to allow specific arms of government, which does include the IRGC, or will rather capture it, I should say.
Thank you. Now, I'll have to leave again for a vote, but I just want to clarify one additional point that you made in your opening statement. It sounded to me like one of the things you were calling on us as a committee to do was to recognise that as we analyse the situation in Iran, we need to recognise that a particular lens of what is happening is horrific treatment, particularly of the Kurdish community in Iran. And I just wanted to clarify that really what you're calling on us to do is take the situation as a whole, but also to recognise that there are particularly severe outcomes and violences being done against the Kurdish community in Iran.
That's correct. There are layers of oppression which exist in Iran, and so if you're a Kurdish woman here in Iran, you have then 2 layers of oppression, yes.
And the Australian government response needs to recognise that nuance and layered nature.
Absolutely. And any view or consideration of what is currently happening in Iran must take into consideration the minority communities, which includes the Kurds.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Come back to your question about why those options are not
Please
viable.
do. I've got to go. I've got to go back to vote now.
Sure.
But please continue that evidence.
Not a problem. No problem. So, in response to Senator Steele-John's question as to why military intervention or broad economic sanctions are not viable options, which is something I also addressed in my opening statement, I'm hoping it goes without saying that foreign military intervention would be an absolute fail and disaster for this movement. No Iranian, either inside or outside Iran, would want military intervention. Iran's future must ultimately be written by the people of Iran on its own streets. What we are asking for in terms of our recommendations, these are to target the perpetrators of the human rights in Iran. Any military intervention is going to make Iranian people suffer, and that's what we don't want. The other issue is on the broad economic sanctions. Again, as we've addressed in our submission, these economic sanctions have actually resulted in collective punishment of the innocent Iranian people without actually impacting the IRI, the Iranian regime. And there are some reports that indicate that IRCG, which is the entity Mr. Magami mentioned, is actually benefiting from these economic sanctions. So the last thing we want is for imposition of any economic sanctions that result in collective punishment of innocent Iranian people. So for that reason, our recommendations are the 6 that are contained in our submission, and not any forms of military intervention, and not any imposition of broad economic sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If no senators have further questions, Mr. Magami, you've got your 90 seconds.
Sorry, I apologise. Before Mr. Magami gives his closing statements, can I just add an answer to
Of course.
Senator Raff's question about what is it that the Australian government can do? What we are, I think, all here asking of the committee, but broadly of the Australian government, is not to protect us here. In Australia, we are safe, and we are incredibly grateful to be Australian citizens and be living in this beautiful country. What we are all ultimately asking for, with specific recommendations and asks of all the communities, is that this government is no longer legitimate in the eyes of its people. And what we need this committee and the Australian government to do is use every diplomatic mechanism available to it to continue to delegitimise this government and bring democracy to Iran so that the people can decide their own future and their own fate.
Thank you. Mr. Magami.
Madam Chair, just to give context, because I think it's already been covered twice, but because we appear on behalf of individuals and a number of organisations, I've been asked to make this short closing, if you would indulge me. The protection of life, whether in Iran or elsewhere, is a matter of moral obligation for all people. Whilst abductions, false charges, show trials, denial of access to legal representation and lifelong sentences, including death penalties, and all trumped-up charges, are nothing new in Iran since the '79 revolution. The ferocity and scale of what is happening in Iran right now is above and beyond what any of us have witnessed or experienced over the last almost 44 years. On display in this room, appearing today, and the people behind me, is only a small taste of what has formed internationally. A global solidarity of the Iranian diaspora, with some 4 to 6 million Iranian, hyphenated Iranians, globally, and about 80,000 in Australia and growing. It's emerged in response to the brutality and viciousness of the Iranian regime in its latest episode, which indicates not only a considerable progress in the thinking of the Iranian people, but also their appreciation and respect for the unique makeup of the Iranian society. The main focus on equality of women and men as one of the most pressing challenges facing Iran is at the forefront of people's mind. But their aim also includes the need for unity in the diversity of cultures, peoples, traditions, and religions that constitute Iranian society as a whole. For the people of Iran, the path ahead is long and hard. However, Iran is a country rich in history, and the Iranian diaspora, many of whom escaped one form of discrimination or persecution at the hands of the current regime in Iran, represent a brain drain from the country and are a community rich not only in material means, but also in culture, spirituality, and love for the fellow beings. The global diaspora is made up of some of the most renowned scientists, mathematicians, doctors, surgeons, lawyers, jurists and advocates for human rights, engineers, bankers, artists, poets, and the rest. A group that is, for the first time in many years, globally united in its resolve to defend the human rights of the people in Iran and help secure the safety, security, and freedom. Alas, we are a group which has faced many challenges, oppression and tyranny, but have always persevered and somehow risen like the phoenix, or as referred to in the Persian literature as the sea morgue. This time will be no different, with or without the help of anybody else. However, with meaningful and tangible support of the bastions of justice and human rights, like the members of this committee, Australia collectively can assist to bring down the cost to human life and ultimately lessen the loss of innocent blood and contain it. And to wrap up, the message is loud and clear. The people in Iran need help and need help urgently. Whilst ultimately light will conquer darkness, at the end when the dust settles, Iranians will remember all those who helped, and I suspect all those who did not.
Thank you, Mr. Maghami. And Ms. Williams, I believe you just had a couple more remarks to make as well.
I just want to say that thank you to the Australian government for consistent support of the Baha'i community. But whatever I say here or others say and I stay silent, then will be used, historically it's been proven, to scapegoat my fellow Baha'is in Iran. So I'm not here to make political commentary and on the regime, because unfortunately I know that it will be used against the Baha'is in Iran. So we have been falsely accused of being a political group and inciting these protests. And so I'm very mindful that we are not asking for political regime change because we don't know what the next regime will do to us. We just want the same rights and equality and justice for the Baha'is and for all Iranian citizens, no matter who is in government.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. I really appreciate your comments. Very good. Well, we are running a little over time and we were due to break now, but the committee has resolved just to push through. So thank you very much to the witnesses from the panel today for appearing. Any answers to questions on notice to be returned by Monday, the 12th of December 2022, and we will bring in our next tranche of witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you.
I told you before, the owners of the kebab shop over the road from the CPO have shut the shop up and have flown back to Iran to help in the protest.
Gosh, that's so brave.
When you consider that I think we've never been allowed to leave again.
Now welcome Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert via teleconference, or video conference rather, and Dr. Saba Vasafi in person. Thank you both for your time today and for making yourself available to the committee to give evidence. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. My name is Senator Claire Chandler and I'm the chair of the committee. Joining us today is Senator Ciccone, the deputy chair, as well as Senators Fawcett, Cadell and Van, and I suspect Senator Steele-John may be back at some point in time. For the Hansard record, would you please each state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? And we'll start with Dr. Vasefi, given she's in the room.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Saba Vasefi. I'm a scholar journalist based in Sydney University.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Moore Gilbert.
Hi, my name is Dr. Kylie Moore-Gilbert. I'm appearing in an individual capacity as a victim of the Iranian regime.
Thank you very much. I understand that you've been asked to table any opening statements, but if there was any sort of short remarks in the vicinity of a couple of minutes that you would like to make to the committee, I'd appreciate it if you could do so now. Again, we'll start with you, Dr. Vasefi, given that you're in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Senators, for inviting me to address this Senate inquiry into human rights implication of recent violence in Iran. I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly about the ongoing atrocity machinery of the Islamic Republic, which is responsible for the escalation of systematic violence and crimes against humanity. In my written submission, I have outlined the extent of 4 decades of violence and the renewed violent crackdown on the protester in the last 2 months. I would now like to especially address the terms of reference for this inquiry. First, recent violence. Mahsa Jina Amini's murder burst open these 4 decades of garage in the throats of thousands of Iranians traumatized by the ruthlessness and the authoritarianism of the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is continuing to use rape to quell protests, and the protesters are at the risk of death penalty. In 2021, Iran was responsible for the 2nd highest rate of execution worldwide after China. Reportedly, Iran has executed at least 251 people in the first half of 2022, including women defending themselves against domestic violence. Until November 19, at least 448 people, including 63 children, have been killed by the regime. Out of the 290 members of the Iranian parliament, 227 called on the country's judiciary to extreme punishment of regime dissident, including issuing death sentence. Apparently, the West is still thinking about the methods of negotiation with the Islamic Republic. While Australia has condemned the violent crackdown of the protesters in the last few weeks, in comparison even with its own allies like Canada, Germany, France, the UK, and the US have not taken any practical action to support Iranians. In 2020, the US Department of State reported on Iran assassinations and terrorist activity abroad. This revealed that since the Islamic Republic came to power in 1979, it has been implicated in assassination, terrorist plots, and terrorist attacks in more than 40 countries. And Iran's global campaign of terror has included as many as 360 targeted assassinations in other countries. The Iranian people who have been persecuted and oppressed in their own country are demanding that nations valuing human rights ostracize their torturers and murderers by delegitimizing them as a recognized government and acknowledging them as a terrorist group. Dozens of Iranians from inside Iran have told me that the financial weakening of the child killer regime can slacken the repressive machinery which brutally slaughter unarmed innocent. This action can also debilitate them to afford suppression equipment and recruit more suppressors. Although the Australian government has no significant economic relationship with Iran, they still can use meaningful sanction to prevent any financial injections to the regime and also encourage their allies to do urgently. Last year, it was reported that the Australian ambassador demanded the enhancement of Al-Mustafa's cooperation with Australia's academic institution. Currently, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister added Al-Mustafa to its sanction list. If Australia has any collaboration with Al-Mustafa, it should denounce this as well, impose sanction on any staff in Australia and deport them to protect our national security. If Australia is reluctant to take any practical action to address the Islamic Republic terrorism and violation due to protecting its citizens who are hostages of the regime, I would like to accent that history demonstrated the negotiation with dictators is not only wrong, but is also dangerous. Hostage-taking has been the Islamic Republic's strategy since they seized power due to appeasement of the West. They have become so insolent that, for example, Mohsen Rezai, the Vice President of Economic Affairs and former Commander-in-Chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has publicly said he would take 1,000 American hostages to boost Iran's economy. For every hostage, he would ask several $1 million as a solution. A regime that treats women as a second-class citizen, systematically violating women's basic rights, must not be a member of UNCSW. The World Economic Forum Global Gender Gaps Index ranks Iran as 150 of the 152nd countries in the world. Many Iranians demand that Australia practically, not verbally, stand in solidarity with them by bravely deporting the Islamic Republic ambassador and all their officials who are working, studying, and living in Australia, and freezing their assets and pause any trade, cultural, and educational engagement with them. I would like to warn you of the Islamic Republic lobbyists who are actively meeting with Western politicians to misrepresent the vision of Iranians who are shielding their chests in front of the bullets to fight for freedom. These groups try to reduce this revolution to a protest for freedom in order to maintain their regime in the global political scene. But I would like to repeat loudly in the Parliament of Australia what Iranians are chanting in the street. The demonstrations are not a protest. It is a revolution to overthrow the religious dictatorship of the Islamic Republic. And I respectfully request the Australian government value women's lives that have been annihilated, the blood that has been shed from life, and the children murdered for freedom by publicly recognizing Iranian revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Moore-Gilbert, I note that you have tabled your opening statement for the committee, but were there any other comments that you wanted to provide at this point?
I was intending to read part of my statement aloud, but
you can do that, Dr. Moore-Gilbert.
Okay, I'll just focus on the part about Australia's response. Firstly, thank you, a huge thank you to the committee for taking the time to investigate this important matter. I know, as you've just heard from many Iranian Australians, there's a lot of anger and frustration in the community that the government hasn't done enough. And I know this Senate inquiry means a lot to many people here watching. So I'll just focus on what more the Australian government can do to support the brave men and women and children of Iran who are risking their lives in the name of values which us here in Australia, we profess to uphold. As outlined in DFAT's submission to this inquiry, the response of the Australian government over the past 10 weeks of brutal crackdown has been primarily one of rhetorical condemnation. Cabinet ministers, MPs and government officials have tweeted, have released statements, have expressed Australia's dismay. We've also joined other countries to voice our concerns within the various fora of the United Nations. And while these steps are welcome, they are inadequate and they don't constitute meaningful action at all. Our lacklustre response, as we've heard earlier today, has been very much thrown into relief when compared with the more robust measures taken by some of our allies, such as Canada, Germany, and the European Union. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about why we've done so little in contrast to some of those other allies I mentioned. And in discussions with people within, you know, government apparatus and other experts, I've heard several explanations, none of which I feel are particularly convincing. These include economic and trade ties, which I understand are fairly minimal in any case. We heard Prime Minister Albanese in Parliament say on the subject of economic ties with Iran that any action taken by the government must be, quote, fully cognizant of the implications for Australian businesses, end of quote, which, you know, for me is quite unclear given the nature of our ties with Iran, which are quite minimal. Also, the importance of the Australian embassy in Tehran. You know, I understand that our embassy is one of the most important Australian diplomatic outposts in the Middle East, and it plays a crucial diplomatic and information gathering role for Australia, but also for some of our Western allies, particularly those that do not have diplomatic relations with Iran. And as a consequence, and perhaps at the request of some of those allies, we might be hesitant to take any action which could damage relations. In my view, this is obviously inherently problematic as well. And the third issue which I raised in my submission was the issue of Iran's hostage diplomacy. And Dr. Vasefi just mentioned that briefly in her remarks as well, that Iran has this long-established practice of taking foreign citizens hostage, including myself, and using them for diplomatic or financial leverage. More than 40 foreigners have been arrested just during the past 10 weeks alone in Iran. And the government has acknowledged that at least one Australian citizen has been arrested this year as well and is currently in an unknown location without consular access in an Iranian prison. My concern is, and I expressed this in my submission, and we've seen this also in the case of Professor Sean Turnell, who was very recently and thankfully freed from prison in Myanmar, is that Australia has resisted imposing sanctions on Iran for fear of complicating efforts to free its unjustly detained citizens in these countries. And, you know, in my view, and that of many in the Iranian Australian community too, none of these reasons should be sufficient to preclude a more robust Australian response to Iran's human rights abuses. Whilst our embassy in Tehran is an important strategic asset, other countries that maintain embassies in Iran, such as Germany and France, have taken a far tougher line on Iran's crackdown without jeopardizing their diplomatic presence. In addition, neglecting to impose sanctions on countries such as Iran and Myanmar because of the arbitrary detention of our citizens sends the signal that Australia's human rights policies can be influenced via what is essentially diplomatic blackmail. And it actually incentivizes hostage taking and hostage diplomacy further. And I'd note that in my own case, there seem to have been no negative implications for Iran whatsoever for not only taking me hostage and essentially extorting the Australian government to do something to free me to the benefit of Iran, but also taking hostage at least 4 other Australian citizens that we know of. We have literally just rewarded them. We've given them what they wanted. We've sent home people arrested in Australia for violating sanctions and sending military equipment in violation of the nuclear program sanctions to Iran. We've conducted very elaborate diplomatic deals to free, for example, myself, involving a prisoner swap deal with the Thai government. We are literally just rewarding Iran for this practice and sending the signal that they should keep doing more and do it again and again because it only benefits them. So I would like to see more engagement with this issue, particularly with respect to the Iranian regime, and I'm happy to speak more if anyone has questions on that later on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moore-Gilbert. I hope that you could hear that applause over the video link. It's a bit harder if you're not in the room. My first questions are to Dr. Moore-Gilbert. Do you think the government is concerned that if it sanctions individuals in Iran that are responsible for human rights abuses, then it will also be expected to do the same for human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Myanmar?
I don't think these issues are at all linked. We have already applied Magnitsky sanctions to Russia over its war in Ukraine and over its killing of Sergei Magnitsky and others involved in torture and human rights abuses in Russian prisons. So the same argument could be applied there. We've sanctioned Russia over its human rights and warmongering behaviour. Why shouldn't we sanction Iran or Myanmar or any other country? I appreciate that diplomatically and economically sanctioning China over Xinjiang, over Hong Kong or other, the huge, vast scale of human rights abuses that are perpetuated in China is much more problematic. But I don't think that it's everything or nothing in this case. As mentioned by other submissions, Australia's ties with Iran are minimal. Our economic ties are not significant at all. I think it's low-hanging fruit, just like with Russia, and particularly Myanmar as well. I think now that Sean Turnell has been freed, there should be a second look at sanctions on Myanmar. Australia is really one of the only Western nations that did not impose any sanctions whatsoever following the coup there. I really don't understand it, this risk aversion and this, this fear, I think, of upsetting some of these authoritarian regimes and perhaps our economic interests by imposing sanctions. That's what the sanctions are there for. They're not there to help us make friends with other countries. They're there for us to send a message and a signal that human rights are important to Australia. And I think in the case of Iran, we would literally be bandwagoning on to dozens of other countries who have already undertaken these measures. So Australia is not going to be singled out in the case of Iran, and I think it's a no-brainer, really, that we should impose sanctions.
Thank you very much. Just onto the topic of hostage diplomacy, obviously this is a very sensitive subject, but Dr. Moore-Gilbert, it's one that you're very well placed to speak about. You expressed in your submission and in your contribution just now that Australia's response may be impacted by what you've described as diplomatic blackmail. You referenced that in your initial comments, but could you expand a bit on what you mean by that expression?
Well, basically, if we are holding back on imposing Magnitsky sanctions, on condemning Iran more forcefully in international fora, or even looking to impact trade or economic ties as a response to this brutal and horrific crackdown on the Iranian people and their human rights, because Iran is holding some of our innocent citizens in their prisons, we are basically allowing the Iranian regime, A, to violate the human rights of innocent Australians by taking them hostage and subjecting them to horrific ill treatment in prison, but B, then influence our foreign policy response to their human rights abuses more broadly. And that, it sends a huge, significant message of weakness to the Iranian authorities, which, after all, only really understand strength. They don't respect weakness. And B, it incentivizes them to do it again and to continue to leverage the taking of Australian citizens hostage as a mechanism to prevent Australia from imposing Magnitsky sanctions, say, listing the IRGC as a terror group, say, and taking any further action. And I would add that the IRGC is the main hostage taker in this case. They were the hostage takers of myself, of Jolie and Mark, the two Australian backpackers who were arrested in 2019, and of several others whose cases are less publicly known. And internationally, there are a number of European, American, and other citizens who still are sitting hostages in Iranian prisons to date because of the IRGC. So listing this group as a terror organisation, which it very clearly is, would also act on the issue of hostage diplomacy as well. Fundamentally, I think there needs to be a response. We've done nothing but reward them so far, and that enables them to continue this passage of diplomatic blackmail further, because they've only been sent a signal thus far that it works and that they get rewards and benefits out of it.
Yes, exactly. And in incentivising this sort of behaviour, I mean, we have to face the reality here. What we're incentivising is the capture of Australian citizens overseas. There are lives on the line.
Yes.
Do you think that governments need to be more transparent about which regimes and states we know are conducting hostage diplomacy?
I do. I think the United States is a model of best practice in this area because they actually have a classification system where they determine when a citizen is, say, arrested or imprisoned in a foreign country, whether this person is the victim of hostage diplomacy or arbitrary detention for some other reason, or whether it's just, a criminal matter. Maybe, we have Australian citizens who do commit crimes overseas and who are justifiably arrested, and we really should be making a distinction between the far fewer number of cases where an Australian is innocent and is clearly and obviously innocent. And there is a UN working group on arbitrary detention, which also makes rulings on such cases. And I'd note that they ruled that in the case of the Australian engineer Robert Pether, who's currently detained in Iraq at the moment. The Australian government has never acknowledged that ruling, nor has it made a ruling of its own that Mr. Pether, for instance, is arbitrarily detained. So I think there is a real need for more openness and transparency around how DFAT and the government more broadly determines which cases are hostage diplomacy or arbitrary detention or wrongful detention, and which cases are, one of, the many thousands of cases of Australians arrested abroad for actually committing crimes. And I think having such a classification, being more open about this, even if, I appreciate you're not always going to reveal the names of the individuals involved or the nature of the negotiations, if there are any, for their release. And, with the one individual, and I suspect there might be more than one, who are arrested in Iran at the moment, if we don't have consular access, if the Iranians won't even allow consular access, how are we even going to talk about the release of this person? We're not negotiating over this person's release. We can't even verify proof of life if this person is still around, is still with us. So in such instances, I think staying silent about it, is not at all useful. And from my experience, actually, having a more open, transparent and robust public inquiry into my prison conditions by the media, for instance, or by politicians, including some, I believe, who were on this panel today, it actually helped my prison conditions. It actually ensured that I had access to medical treatment, and perhaps, greater attention was paid to my access to legal assistance as well. So whether or not somebody's case is open and transparent can actually directly affect their treatment under such conditions as well.
So would you be supportive of Australia looking at a scheme similar to what the United States has to ensure greater transparency over these hostage diplomatic situations?
Absolutely. I have done quite a lot of work behind the scenes, engaging with DFAT, engaging with government and opposition politicians on this matter, along with a couple of other interested people. And, the government's well aware of what my views are on the matter. We have called for a SPIHA, a Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, which is the official title in the United States, for an equivalent office to be established here in Australia. I know this is taking us quite far from the issue of human rights in Iran, of this inquiry, but there is a real need for some sort of robust and clear policy on arbitrary detention in Australia, not some ad hoc system where DFAT sort of follows their own internal processes, which aren't even spelled out within, policy or, there are quite few number of cases comparatively, so perhaps that has worked, but we know they're on the rise now, arbitrary detention cases, and there is a real need for a firm, fixed policy managed by a specific individual with specific processes in place for engagement with families, engagement with the media, assistance once that person comes home as well, and also to form broader policy thinking and strategy around how to disincentivize this practice, not just react to it each time it happens.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moore-Gilbert. Dr. Vasafi, thank you for your incredibly powerful submission. Is it fair to say that your view is that, based on personal experience, there is absolutely no prospect the current regime can be negotiated with or encouraged to improve its treatment of women and ethnic and religious minorities?
Absolutely. The dictators, as I mentioned, they are not negotiable. They are not reformable. And I think the delay I am witnessing from the Western society, it's because I think they are not still believing that Iranian people with an empty hand, they are resisting such a powerful dictatorship, and they will overthrow them
definitely. But I think the West, especially Australia, didn't believe them. Still, they think if people wouldn't win this revolution, what is happening between, diplomatic relationship between Iran and Australia. And as I mentioned in my submission, it is not one incident, violation of human rights or practice of crimes against humanity. It is if the West currently came to realization to discover or try to comprehend what is going on in Iran, this practice has happened over 4 decades. And as I listed, it is, historically, you can see massive amount of documents are out there to demonstrate this regime is a fundamentalist, totalitarian, authoritarianist, and dictator, which is not reformable and negotiable. And it is, I am still receiving questions from Australian people if we close Iran's embassy or if we deport Iran's official from Australia, we are closing all the relationship, all the conversation. But this is my question. Why Australia is looking for negotiation or relationship with a rapist regime, child killer regime? If one of those over 60 children, if one of them was a white child, how would Australia would respond? They are not white enough to be worthy enough to be considered as a human, that they are losing their life? It is concerning. It is serious concerning the indifference, indifference that I am seeing in Australia. The question I am receiving, just they are still thinking about how they can negotiate. But, for a long time, Iran has had embassy in Australia. Iran took hostage from Australia. What Australia did? If someone steals something from you, would you allow that person to live with you in your home? How would you respond?
An argument. Thank you. An argument's been put by some that, or some nations, some people, that allowing Iran to remain on the UN Commission on the Status of Women is a mechanism to help them improve their treatment of women.
Have they improved over 4 decades?
I was just about to say, I don't
God.
think you're convinced by that argument, are you, Dr. Vasefi?
Over 4 decades. Imagine, I am so glad that even if after Islamic Revolution they killed so many people invisibly, they remain invisible, faceless. But now cyberspace and usage of mobile can give you massive amount of visual evidences. You are witnessing what are they going on in Iran, and they are calling women's protester prostitute. And is there any evidence to prove? And this is the stigma they are using to misrepresent all feminists or Iranian women's activists for a long time, to misrepresent them, to push them to the background. And, I would like you to have a look at the facts, rather than just listening to them just by marking, or stigmatizing protesters in order to legitimize their cruelty and atrocity. And I saw some of their submission in Australia, and they are claiming, no, they are the people, we didn't kill anyone. Who killed? Okay, you are denying that you killed Iranian in the street. Who are arresting these people? Who are raping in the jail? I remember, as I mentioned in my submission, my brother was a young photojournalist, humble photojournalist. They arrested him in front of my eyes, and they were dragging him on the floor, and he was screaming, "Don't capitulate to them, don't scare." I was frozen. I could not scream to ask for any help. Without any trial, without any court, they lashed him. When he came back from the jail, he was bruised. My mom tried to make complaint to take them to the court. They said, no, we didn't hit him. We didn't lash him. Who lashed him? And they tried to stigmatize us as a liar. On the Twitter, since I talk in ABC Q&A, they are tagging me, "We drag you down." I would not capitulate, and I would ask everyone not capitulating to the terrorist regime. What they are doing, they are killing people. It's about flesh, blood, and humans are not unlimited sources. Sometimes, some point, you will be destroyed. Don't allow to do that.
Thank you, Dr. Vasefi.
just I am trying to tell you what they are claiming, that no, they are all liars, or we are only legitimate people on the earth. It is not true. So many things I exposed to multi-layer of violence, but I can't forget everything. But never, I can't forget to witness the bruised body of my brother. And all of those people in the street, they are in the place of my brother. I believe them. And it is sad. Those people, some of them, they are trying to legitimizing Iranian regime claim here these days. I observe so many of them accuse refugees are liars as well, because they try to justify Iran is a safe place to live. So I would like to ask you to pay attention. Who are you dealing with? And be cautious and conscious about their lobbies who are justifying their atrocity. Have a look at the facts. The facts is in the street, and all the footages are available.
Thank you.
Dr. Fasafi, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Vasafi. I recognise that it's not always easy to come along to these forums and share your stories, but we really appreciate your testimony. I'm going to give the call to Senator Fawcett.
Dr. Fasafi, thank you for powerfully calling evil by its name.
Thank you.
Dr. Fasafi, one of the comments that you made in closing your initial evidence to us was that we should call this a revolution, not a protest. I'd just be interested to know whether that is something that you think, whether that was a rhetorical finish or whether that is actually a measure that you think is important, and why you think that will make a difference in terms of the actions of the regime against the people of Iran. Clearly, it would show that we believe the people want regime change. They want to see that system of control overthrown. But I'm interested in your view as to whether it would reinforce the regime's claim, which we have seen in the media many times, that the protest has been incited by foreign powers, as opposed to being an internal rising up.
Let them, they claim whatever they want. They are claiming so many things. Should we capitulate to what they are claiming? I remember when I was writing about Dr. Kylie Gilbert Moore, they summoned my parents and they said to me, I got paid by Israel to write about Dr. Kylie Gilbert Moore. And they said, and my parents said to them, so many people are writing about these issues. They said, because they are white, they are not Iranian, I am betraying my country. They are claiming, I'm not afraid of their claims. Why Australia is afraid of their claims? Let them say whatever they want. You stand for humanity, you stand with us. And recognize this revolution. Recognize in the public. Why we are not hearing, why the Minister Penny Wong is not conducting any interview to clarify her position. I'm still waiting for her response to confirm whether or not she's happy to allow me to conduct an interview with her. Why the Prime Minister of Australia does not come to the public and acknowledge this is a revolution. Just empty words, just we are supporting women and girls. What sort of support? There is two sides of support. One side in Australia, okay, I think there should be some women here from Nauru. She was here, yeah. They have been 10 years in limbo. They are women of girls who escaped from gendered violence. If you're going to support inside Australia, if you're going to support outside of Australia, just kick all the fundamentalists out of your Western democracy and close your relationship. Would you like to negotiate with Al-Qaeda as a terrorist regime? Iran is the same. Just we need to recognize them as a terrorist regime. And look at the facts, historical facts. How many lives they have annihilated.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett. Senator Van.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you both so much for appearing today. And Dr. Vasefi, your passion is coming through loud and clear, and we hear that at every protest I go to, including the one out the front going on right now. I've some questions for Dr. Maud Gilbert, but first let me say thank you for your bravery, for everything you went through, for you still to have the courage to show up here today. We are all very, very thankful for you. I read your submission and I agree with all of your recommendations. However, I note one of them's not to remove the embassy here in Canberra. I'm very cognizant of how good our ambassador, Ambassador Sachs, is in Tehran, and I recognise that there are others that are still facing the ordeal that you went through. Do you believe that obviously if we kick out Iran's embassy, they will likely kick out ours. Do you agree that we should probably keep our embassy there?
Thank you, Senator Van. Yes, in the recommendations of my submission, I did not include this point, and I'd note that Dr. Vasefi and a lot of other Iranian Australians are demanding the closure of the embassy in Canberra. I'm not of the view that that is practical or likely to happen. I do think that having some diplomatic presence in Iran is obviously to Australia's benefit. I personally benefited from that. I know many American former hostages who were in prison in Iran also, like myself, and did not have, obviously, an American embassy on the ground, able to visit them, able to advocate for them with the Iranian authorities, able to attend the prison and bring them money, for instance, something so basic, but to buy food and medicine with, which is necessary. So from the perspective of somebody who was a beneficiary of Australia having an embassy in Tehran, I do think it's useful to keep some diplomatic presence there. And Lyndall Sachs, I pay tribute to her. She is an utterly fantastic ambassador and really went above and beyond for me when I was there in prison. I also, though, would echo what some of the other submissions and people who've appeared and spoken this morning have noted, which is the Iranian embassy in Canberra is not a regular diplomatic outpost. There are plenty of examples in other parts of the world of Iranian so-called diplomats actually being IRGC operatives, smuggling explosives in via the embassy diplomatic bag, or conducting surveillance of local diaspora communities. I would suspect their embassy in Canberra, whilst I wouldn't accuse them of, anything terrorism related with no evidence, I would just say that, as has been documented by previous submissions, they are conducting surveillance operations here in Australia, and I would imagine the embassy would have had some sort of involvement with that. So whilst, like in the case of Russia, we haven't kicked out the ambassador there, we could pare down the embassy and perhaps have greater scrutiny of some of the non-essential diplomatic staff members there and ask questions about what exactly they are doing and whether they are a danger to the Australian-Iranian community here, within our borders. On the issue of infiltration as well, I'd like to add that I don't think that the response from authorities has been adequate. I was listening to the previous session as well. I myself have been targeted after my return to Australia by the Iranian regime. I've had people attend events that I've spoken at, stand at the back of the room and record proceedings and ask intimidating and suspicious questions of some of the Iranian audience members at my events. I've also been hacked on at least 2 occasions by the Iranian regime and I suspect by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. I received almost no assistance whatsoever with this hacking. Some of my financial information was posted in Farsi language Iranian government affiliated news outlets last year from that hack. And I called the cybersecurity hotline in great distress, asking what on earth can I do about this? They're in my computers. What do I do? I was told I just need to install antivirus software and nobody can help me. I only was able to obtain assistance from the security services, reaching out via private channels to private individuals that I thankfully have been in touch with, who have links within, Australia's security establishment, who were able to assist me eventually to get these guys out of my devices. But I have been threatened, I have been hacked, received no assistance whatsoever, and I suspect that is the tip of the iceberg. Anything that I have been through, there are countless Iranian Australians probably in this room today who've actually been through worse, and have been hacked multiple times, as well as being followed in the streets and threatened and intimidated. And I am yet to see any meaningful or robust response by the Australian authorities on this matter.
We've heard a lot of rhetoric on that point on Magnitsky-style sanctions. It was around this time last year that we enabled the legislation for those sanctions to go ahead. Do you agree that it's beyond time that they were levelled against the Iranian regime and the IRGC? Or can you see any reason why we should hold back one more day?
I cannot see any reason whatsoever. I am totally bewildered as to why we haven't actually sanctioned anybody under Magnitsky other than a handful of Russians. And I really don't understand it. There was a lot of reticence toward adopting Magnitsky at all from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I understand that it makes conducting diplomacy more difficult with some of these nations, but at the end of the day, we have our diplomatic needs on one hand, but we also have our human rights obligations on the other. Again, I see Iran as low-hanging fruit here. Unlike China, unlike some other regimes in the world that we actually do a lot of business with and have, it's more in the national interest for us to maintain robust diplomatic relations with. Iran is really not a significant country for Australia, and I don't see why we can't impose Magnitsky sanctions. I would add that I submitted a list of names to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the previous government, requesting Magnitsky sanctions be considered to be applied to those Iranian individuals on my list, and that list was compiled through an international effort involving a couple of British anti-torture NGOs and a triangulation of evidence from more than 20 victims of hostage diplomacy and arbitrary detention of the Iranian regime. We were able to identify the names of perpetrators of Iran's hostage diplomacy business model, including officials within Evin prison, several interrogators, and officials within the Iranian system more broadly who perpetuate the taking of innocent citizens as hostages. We submitted these names to the Australian Minister of Foreign Affairs and received no response whatsoever, and no, effort to explore even applying Magnitsky sanctions to these individuals. I really don't understand what Australia stands to lose by doing so, and I really, really hope that in the future we will impose Magnitsky sanctions.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. And a number of the backbenchers around this table fought very hard for those sanctions to be brought in. You will note that within days of the invasion that there was bipartisan support for sanctions on the Russian regime. One last question. Would you be able to table that list of names for this committee?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Senator Van. There being no other questions from senators for these witnesses, I will thank you very much for appearing today, and we will organise the teleconference for our next set. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I would now like to welcome Professor Ben Saul as well as Dr. Dara Conduit from the University of Melbourne. Thank you both for your time. Information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. My name is Senator Claire Chandler and I'm the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by Senator Ciccone, the deputy chair, as well as Senators Fawcett and Van. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today? And we will start with Dr. Conduit.
Hello, thank you, Chair. My name is Dr. Dara Conduit. I'm an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow at the University of Melbourne.
Thank you. And Professor Saul.
Professor Ben Saul, Challis Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney.
Thank you very much. I understand that you've been asked to provide or table opening statements if you have one. In the interests of time, it might be handy if we could keep opening remarks as brief as possible to allow the committee members time to answer questions or ask questions, I should say. And we have just received those documents at the table. So, Dr. Conduit, did you have anything that you wished to add to your opening statement that's just been tabled?
Maybe if I could just highlight, I guess, what I think are the most important points, particularly in the follow-up to the previous session. Thank you. So many of the other speakers here today have eloquently described the appalling human rights situation in Iran, including the way that many of them and their families have been personally affected. And I think Dr. Vasefi's presentation just now, and also Kylie's, really speaks to just how violent this regime is and just how dangerous it is. One theme that came through really strongly in this, in that session, I think, was the theme of technology and technology-facilitated repression, and just how significant that is in what the Iranian regime is done right now. I'm currently researching this as part of a research fellowship I'm on. And so I guess I just wanted to draw your attention to the issue of digital rights in Iran at the moment. Digital rights are not only an important issue in terms of it's a human rights issue, it's related to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is the right to freedom of expression, but also because technology is providing the very backbone of the Iranian regime's crackdown, and I think that's really important to highlight. So I guess to that end, I made 5 recommendations in the opening statement, which you can read at your leisure later on. But I wouldn't mind just drawing attention to 3 of them that I think are particularly important for the Australian government to address. The first, in relation to digital rights, is, as was discussed extensively in the previous session, is the Australian government must use its Magnitsky sanctions to target individuals, members of the Iranian regime who are involved in the digital rights crackdown. And this includes the 17 members of the Supreme Council of Cyberspace, some members of which, such as the Minister of Information and Communications Technology, Issa Zarakpour, have close ties to Australia. And so applying Magnitsky sanctions will be extremely effective. My second recommendation is that Australia must speak with locally based representatives of the global technology sector to ensure that they understand their responsibilities in protecting the human rights of the Iranian people, and to ensure that they understand just how important technology is at the moment, not only for helping the Iranian people to organise, but also helping them to document the crimes that they are witnessing on the street. And this documentation is not just important in terms of what's going on today, but it will be important in the future in terms of future justice efforts as well. So the international tech sector has got a really important role to play here. And so Australia must underline the importance of providing high quality Persian language and culturally informed social media moderation in order to prevent freewheeling online harassment and disinformation from regime bots and troll farms, to protect the freedom of expression of protesters, and prevent the sort of hacking that Kylie was just talking about in the previous session. At the moment, this sort of activity falls really far short at Meta, and it's under serious threat amid the chaos at Twitter. So it's something that the Australian government needs to be on the front foot about. I'd like to draw attention to the Australian government's need to provide, again, as Kylie was talking about, digital security support to Iranian nationals based in Australia. I think the fact that 60% of the 95 written submissions to this inquiry, the fact that they were submitted on an anonymous basis, underlines that fear is palpable among the Iranian diaspora in Australia. The previous sessions have spoken to this too. And so we, as a government, the Australian government certainly needs to provide support to these people, so that it's not like Kylie. I remember when Kylie was hacked, I was speaking to her about it. We were trying to find ways to keep her safe. Kylie's lucky that she is someone who is well connected. There are plenty of Iranian Australians in the community right now that don't have those connections and that can't receive the digital support that she received. And finally, I think Australia must, I guess to follow up with Dr. Vasefi's point, Australia must review whether our sanctions are standing in the way of technology firms assisting Iranian nationals in what's going on in the streets right now. Significant work's been done in the US on this front, including creating sanctions waivers for tech firms. And I'm not sure what's happening in Australia at the moment, whether there are Australian companies who could potentially be helping the Iranian people right now and who are afraid of doing so because they might fall afoul of Australian sanctions. My understanding of Australian companies that are worried about Australian autonomous sanctions is they often interpret them quite broadly, and in where I've seen it, some companies will refuse to have anything to do with Iranian nationals in fear of falling afoul of these laws. So I think there needs to be some sort of review done so that we can understand whether our own autonomous sanctions are actually not helping Iranian people on the street right now, because international technology partners will continue to be crucial in the protection of digital rights. And providing things like satellite internet, VPN, and encryption technology, and we can't inadvertently stand in their way. So I guess I just want to close by underlining why it's so important that Australia stands for digital rights and internet use in Iran. Now, by reading the words of the Iranian actress Hengame Ghaziani, who was arrested last week after uploading a hijabless video of herself tying up her hair on an Iranian street. Alongside the video that she uploaded on Instagram was the wording, "Maybe this will be my last post. From this moment on, whatever happens to me, know that, as always, I am with the Iranian people until my last breath." And that was enough for her to be silenced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Conduit. Professor Saul.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Senators. I'm really pleased to see that there's such strong bipartisan concern about Iran's escalating human rights violations, which have been occurring for many decades, as we know. I'm also pleased that the UN Human Rights Council has established an independent inquiry, and I think there's a real opportunity for Australia to offer practical support to that inquiry, if it's needed, by devoting law enforcement or intelligence resources to collecting and sharing evidence, and even providing funds or investigators. I support unilateral sanctions, and I wanted to just say a few things beyond my submission in an opinion piece I had in the Sydney Morning Herald today. Look, of course, unilateral sanctions are often symbolic. They are less effective than multilateral sanctions, but they're still really important in stigmatising and deterring violators, expressing solidarity with victims, some of whom you heard from today, bringing pressure for accountability and reaffirming Australia's and a global commitment to human rights. And this is true even if those targeted might retaliate. Human rights are fundamental and non-negotiable Australian values. Currently, Regulation 6A of the Autonomous Sanctions Regulations implements the serious human rights violations threshold under the Magnitsky Act in an unduly narrow way. It only covers killings, torture, or slavery, servitude, or forced labour. Now, killings and torture are, of course, occurring in Iran, but such a narrow approach does not do justice to the victims of the spectrum of other rights violations in Iran. Australian sanctions should equally be able to denounce mass arbitrary arrests and detention, grossly unfair trials and excessive punishments for vague theocratic crimes, gender persecution, systematic suppression of political and media freedoms, and persecution of minorities like the Kurds and followers of the Baha'i faith. The government should widen the regulations to capture these and the many other serious human rights violations that occur in many countries. So I think this inquiry is an opportunity to reflect on how to improve our Magnitsky sanctions regime more generally. The regulation should cover other thresholds in the Act which have not been implemented. These include serious violations of international humanitarian law, including by Iran and its proxies in Syria and elsewhere, and threats to international security. Surprisingly, even the Act itself omits international crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity, which also should be covered. Sanctions on Iran are certainly warranted, but other countries, including some of our allies, also deserve sanctions for grave human rights violations. So I do think we need a more proactive and less reactive global human rights sanctions strategy by having some kind of process, and I suggest one in my opinion piece, some sort of process to impartially assess which countries deserve sanctions, to put those recommendations to the foreign minister for a final diplomatic decision, taking into account all of the other relevant factors that are obviously in the mix, and to ensure that there is public input. This inquiry is a fantastic opportunity on Iran, but I do think this should be systematised so that whenever sanctions are on the table, there is an opportunity for the public to have that input. Sanctions should also take into account the necessity and proportionality of sanctions, which the current law does not require the minister to do. There should be coordination with other countries' sanctions, which virtually never happens across the Western countries which have Magnitsky sanctions, according to a recent study. And finally, as the Law Council of Australia has suggested, Australia's sanctions could do better in providing due process within, obviously, the constraints of protecting intelligence and conducting diplomacy to ensure that we don't lose credibility by abusing human rights in the name of fighting for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Saul. I might ask my first questions to Dr. Conduit. Really interesting submission. How do you assess the Iranian regime's capability to conduct disinformation, misinformation, foreign interference campaigns through digital platforms?
So this is something that the Iranian regime, to my knowledge, has been active in since, I think, possibly 2011, 2012. So it's something that it's been working on for a really long time, and it's something that it learns. It's extremely innovative, and it learns about every day. So, I'm working with a team on a data set, that spans this entire period. And if you look at the early years of this, it was quite rudimentary, but it's something that gets better and better as time goes on. I guess so far, to my knowledge, it hasn't had massively successful broad-based disinformation campaigns, although it has tried. Where it has been really successful is these targeted campaigns. So sort of like what Dr. Vasefi was talking about in the previous session, or what Dr. Moore-Gilbert was talking about in the previous session, where, they target individuals, they target, parts of the movement and try to, discredit people. And that's been really powerful.
And in regards to the crackdown on internet usage in Iran, is it your understanding that those Iranians who are finding ways to communicate to the outside world through whatever platforms they can are risking extrajudicial violence, arrest, long-term imprisonment, execution as the consequence of what they're doing?
I think any Iranian person at the moment who is trying to circumvent the restrictions is facing all of the above.
Yeah.
But certainly there are huge efforts at the moment to circumvent. In 2019, 2020, there was a crackdown, a very successful crackdown, on protests, where there was an internet shutdown, that eventually made the protests go away. The protest movement's much more successful this time. They are actively, every time the Iranian government shuts down some app or shuts down some part of the internet, activists are now providing live information about, new VPNs that have worked, links to new sites, apps they can download. So the Iranian government is, to an extent, playing whack-a-mole on this, but anyone involved in that is certainly taking grave risks to their own safety.
And you mentioned in your opening comments that you, or alluded to the fact that Meta and Twitter are not doing enough to prevent this from happening. You said that you would like the government to do more in the absence of greater action from the social media companies. What are the social media companies actually doing?
Okay, it's not that I want the government, I don't think the government necessarily has a role in this, but it certainly needs to make very clear its expectations on these companies. I'm certainly not encouraging a censorship regime of my own. At the moment, these organisations, do largely through their, corporate public responsibility campaigns or social responsibility campaigns, do undertake content moderation at the moment, but it's very ham-fisted, particularly Meta. Meta is really bad at this, and this is really important because Meta owns Instagram, which is one of the most important apps right now in Iran. And I talked about this in my submission. This means that things happen like, the Iranian regime will get a pile of bots to follow accounts, and then we'll get those bots to report the accounts. Opposition accounts, and those opposition accounts will be removed from Instagram because of this flurry of bots reporting those accounts for breaching their terms. Things like "death to the dictator" and slogans like that are banned by Meta and have been deleted. Posts have been deleted, from Facebook on that basis. "Death to the dictator" is a really common, it sounds violent, I guess, in the Australian context, but it's a really common slogan. In Iran, it's based on, it comes from, a long history of using "death to the United States," "death to the great Satan," "death to Great Britain." It comes out of that context. It's sort of like a repurposing of the regime's own language. But protesters are having their posts deleted for using that. And at the same time, accounts, for example, the Supreme Leader's account on Twitter remains up, while protesters are posting photos, for example, of Mahsa Amini's body and are getting deleted. So, both Meta and Twitter, I think, are not doing a great job of understanding, the socio-political context in which these protests are taking place. They certainly do not have the Persian language moderation that they need to have. And I think in some ways it's they're almost playing into the hands of this regime, The Supreme Leader is allowed to keep his account when the people who are being killed in his name, are being thrown off Twitter. So, I think it's a really important issue.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Sorry.
Particularly when documentation of these crimes is so important. We've seen from previous conflicts like the Syrian conflict that social media has played such an important role in future legal proceedings. The documentation on social media is really important, so it's really important that it's protected.
Yes, Senator Van.
I have to go speak on this in the chamber in a minute.
Right.
Can I have one comment through you, Chair?
Yes.
Is it possible for the Secretariat to invite Meta, etc., to appear before this committee? Because I think it's a very good suggestion.
Something that this committee could consider at a future point, and I also note that the social media inquiry committee has also been re-established, so that might be something that they might be interested in looking at as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Conduit. I will say I have been contacted by numerous members of the Iranian community who are very concerned, the Iranian community in Australia who are very concerned about what is happening on social media, the approaches that have been made to them on social media. So really appreciate your testimony today. On that front, Senator Ciccone, Deputy Chair, did you have some questions?
Look, I do. Just one quick one, just to follow on from that line of question that you had, and thank you, Doctor, for appearing today. I'm interested in your focus on the freedom of the internet. I think you described it as digital rights. Could you just reflect on why this is...
I've got to go to this vote. Dr. Saul, could I just ask one question of you, if you could give the committee the evidence in my absence? I believe you've indicated you don't think that we could list
I've got that question. I can
the
ask
Guard,
it later.
particularly in the light of what we did with Hezbollah, where they were part of the Lebanese government, but we still listed them. I'd be interested in your comments. Thank you.
Professor Saul, we'll come back to that matter in a second because I did have some questions on that. So we'll continue with Senator Ciccone asking his.
I might just start again, but just with all the distractions that we had, unfortunately, with the visions happening today. Doctor, I was just interested in your focus on the freedom of the internet, and I was hoping you could reflect a bit and elaborate a bit more, I guess, on why this is important in light of what you've already discussed with the Chair as well too.
Okay, well, I mean, freedom of the internet from a very basic standpoint of human rights, and I think Professor Saul is probably more qualified to talk on the human rights front than I am, but it relates to Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which protects freedom of expression. Last year, the UN Human Rights Council reiterated and passed a resolution affirming the right to freedom on the internet. And in particular, the right of, recognizing the role of the internet in, not only in daily life and in, the ability of people to make livelihoods and that sort of thing, but also in, in terms of political rights, civil society, and all of these things. So the internet is crucial, to this, and it's a fundamental tool of freedom of speech in today's world. And I guess we sort of take that for granted in Australia. And it's only when things like this happen in Iran that you can see just how important the internet becomes, when it's one of the few ways that Iranian people can have their voices heard, that won't, that they won't be silenced. And I think I used the quote in my written submission that Karim Sajjadpour had said, that the Iranian regime turned off the internet because it wishes to repress people in the dark, and the internet is the only thing keeping Iranian people in the light right now.
Thank you. Professor, I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything.
No, nothing from me, thanks.
Okay, well, I might just ask you this other question before I also head off. You say in your submission that if we were to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, it's not possible under Australia's legal system. Could you explain to the committee why that is the case?
Yeah, so under the Criminal Code, you can only list as a terrorist organisation a body corporate or an unincorporated association. So these are essentially, corporations, NGOs, or informal groupings of people, no matter how small. The way that's been interpreted by the Australian courts is that it excludes state entities of any kind, really. And so to go to the earlier question about the distinction between the Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah, I mean, Hezbollah is a non-state political movement in Lebanon. Its members were elected, some were elected as part of the Lebanese government, and obviously held some positions of power in the Lebanese government, but Hezbollah itself was a non-state entity, sponsored by other states, of course, as well, but essentially is an autonomous non-state group. The difference with the Revolutionary Guards is that it is incorporated as part of the Iranian state military. That's my understanding of its status. Its origins are different. It originated as a non-state movement in the revolution, but subsequently has been clearly incorporated into the Iranian state military apparatus. And the reason we don't list states, a few countries do enable the listing of states. Not many do. Two reasons really. One is if you list, let's say you change the legislation, you listed a state entity. There's really not much point in doing that, because the consequence of listing primarily is a whole raft of criminal offences which go to membership, recruitment, etc. And of course, if you're part of the Iranian state, then you've got state immunity before Australian domestic courts. So there's really no point in doing that. There's no exception for terrorism from state immunity. The second point is a more historical, which is, why has terrorism generally not been defined as including states internationally? And the reason for that is that Western states generally have argued against it by saying that other areas of international law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, the law on the use of force, the UN Charter, all of that already applies to states. So if states are committing unlawful violence, they're already war criminals or committing the international crime of aggression, etc. There's a right of self-defense against them. Labeling them as terrorists just doesn't give you anything extra that is seen to be valuable. Developing states, on the other hand, have long argued for it, because they say, the primary source of terrorism globally is the West, Western violence against the developing world. So that's the historical context.
Okay, and my last question really goes to, what can the Commonwealth Government, I guess, acknowledging what you've just said, what can the Commonwealth Government do, I guess, to address some of those concerns that have been flagged, and I guess some of the concerns or issues that you've flagged in your submission to the committee?
Look, I think the primary response should be to use the Magnitsky Act sanctions, as I suggested, to amend the regulation so that you can widen the basis on which you can target the full range of human rights violations which are happening in Iran, so that we're not just focused too narrowly on death and torture, but we also deal with the persecution of minorities, gender persecution, which is the genesis of the current conflict in Iran, but also the range of other human rights violations, whether it's media freedoms or freedom of expression on the internet. I mean, there are a whole range of things which our sanctions should target, and I think it does matter because it obviously widens the pool of people or entities which Australian sanctions would target. But it also has an important symbolic effect that you're demonstrating to the Australian community, to Iran itself, and to victims that you do care about serious rights violations across the board, not just a very narrow subset of what the regulation targets, which was described in the explanatory memorandum as physical integrity rights alone. Well, just not being killed or tortured is not all that matters in terms of human rights. And if you think about it, at the moment, we can impose sanctions for killing one person like Magnitsky himself, but you can't impose sanctions for gender persecution against half of the Iranian population of tens of millions of people, or you can't impose sanctions for persecution of religious minorities in Iran. And I just think it's nonsensical. It's a very poor sense of how you should interpret serious human rights violations. Obviously, you don't want every possible rights violation to be sanctionable, but we're talking here about really systematic, broad-based violations affecting large numbers of people.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. Thank you, Dr. Conduit and Professor Saul, for appearing today. Really appreciate you taking the time, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses who appeared today. It was a really informative hearing. Given our reporting timeframe, the committee has asked that any answers to questions on notice be returned by Monday the 12th of December 2022, and I'm sure to aid in the quick response to those questions, any senators who have questions for witnesses will provide them in a timely fashion as well. And the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.